He had yet to remove his mantle of gold, that cold certainty of judgment that weighed on his mind like a heavy crown. He needed it to stay calm with the revelation of how many had arrived. 70,000 ships in his system, and a new keep needing to be constructed to house all the attendees of the moot. No war rations could be accumulated in such conditions, his world practically being stripped bare as those locusts ate all his crops. It was unfortunate his ally would be displeased, but understanding, not feeding guests, would violate their rights, and even now he owed the Exodus, Lord Wergogild, for his assistance. Debts were unfortunate things, and he loathed them. 70,000 ships. There were not enough Exodite ships in existence to match that number, even if they sent everything they had, which means there were non-Exodites in his system, and in the moot, something he was hoping to avoid entirely. Merchant princes and core world refugees coming in civilian ships and eating his food stores and generally being a nuisance on his planet. What use were merchants and refugees in a war effort? Nothing. They traded for exotic souls and slaves. They busied themselves with tortures and pleasure machines. Worthless fools that never fought a day in their lives. Worthless bodies eating his food and complaining about the quality and contributing nothing because they knew nothing of actual work. He ground his teeth, keeping his red anger shackled in chains of gold. Much as he despised them, Roboute wanted to help as many as possible, claiming they can learn. Asenil doubted this. They walked a worthless life road, and they had been walking it for a long time. Deviating from it would be difficult for all, impossible for some. Just like them, Roboute had been walking his life road for too long. Deviation would be nearly impossible for him, even if they could afford it. A twilight king, lord of a crumbling empire, too used to using everything possible in desperation to keep his people alive and united even a year longer. A statue, stone flesh wearing away from metal bones. He could not see that his arrival on Charnak had changed his legend. He wasn't a twilight king anymore. He was a dawn prince now. He could afford to cut away less useful things and keep only the good to build the strongest foundations of his empire and for himself. He could afford to live instead of merely surviving. Asanil would persist in his efforts regardless. This white cycle was only possible by Roboute's arrival. He owed it to his friend to ensure that he enjoys life. Now he just needed to help stern-eyed Miriel seduce him. But how would he go about that? Roboute had been too relaxed to notice her persistent stare during the massage. Dragon Lord, it is time for the moot. Wretched Savan decided to interrupt his silver scheming with a reminder that Asanil had duties as a host. Duties to wretched Fushir, guests that eat all his food and most likely spent all their years before the forewarned calamity strapped and thrashing on tables. Mindless animal eld being nuked for their sensations. Savan should have fed them to the dragons, or at least sent them away, not offer them guest rights. Gold weighed on his brow, making his stand and nod expressionless. Donning the cloak of a dragon lord, he pushed from his chambers and moved to enter the webway as it formed in front of him. A step later, he was in the ugly new fortress on his favorite mountain, and Savan close behind him. Another step later, and the temporary gate behind him closed, and an escort of his dragon knights stepped forwards to flank him along his way. 10 more steps, and he was at the entrance of the massive moot hall hastily constructed for this exact occasion. 10,000 speaking eld in that chamber, at least half of which he would rather not have on his nice world. There used to be bare, beautiful mountain here, and the sun would hit this side perfectly in the evenings of winter, and now that was gone for some massive, ungainly fortress that he wouldn't need after this. His brow twitched in red. The inevitable jaws of certain death touched his mind in white-green. He returned the touch with gold red, and his companion understood. He breathed in heavily, then out again, and stepped through the gates. The massive, gaudy chamber was large enough to fit a 10-circle of knights in its innermost stage, circled by ring after ring of seating that extended upwards for hundreds of feet. Enough seating for tens of thousands, in a chamber that he could do little else but host theatre in hereafter. He thought he was done with theatre when he joined the Exodus, fleet and left the core worlds behind him. And of course, filling the first several rings of seating were 10,000 eld. About half of which he would prefer were not here. In the seating, directly adjacent to the theatre circle, were the figures of particular note. Robut was there, his presentations next to him at Reddit. Malekith Malorn was there, standing as titanically as any Prince of Eld ought, Lord Commander of the Exodus fleet. A full 6 of his fellow Dragon Lords. A figure he did not recognize, and there were the rest of them, a handful of merchant princes, a handful of core world princes, and several others he assumed were equally worthless. Highest honored among degenerates and slavers was lowest honored among heroes. Their most noble members were likely their toy makers. None of that now, Asanil. You had to speak with these creatures now. First was the formalities. Stepping to the center of the theater circle, he stood straight, cast his gaze among the assembled Eld, and focused his mind to project his voice. Even through the aegis of Charnak's spirit, he could feel the fuchsia stare of she who thirsts upon him. He sneered at it, a crown of weighty gold holding down his burning red. His sword art twitched. It did not have the right to exist in his sight. Gathered Eld, he began, voice powerful and carrying throughout the chamber with admittedly well-done acoustics. Now begins this moot of calamities. Some of the fatter ones twitched and sneered at that. By declaring a moot of calamities, he declared that this moot would not be delayed for any reason, such as food or drink. Serve the locust right, and he would get this with faster. I am Asanil, once Calador, Dragon Lord of Charnak, 4-crowned master of the bloody-handed arts, a warrior of greater experience than any save his fellow Exodite kings. Some of the refugee princes looked confused by that declaration. The fools forgot the old ways, it seems. He could crush them with 3 of his fingers and a stern glare. He supposed it would be best to get right to the point. Isha lives. A ripple of discussion and emotions washed over the chamber. Savan reinforced the world spirit just in time for Fuchsia to clash against it. After a few moments, the tide receded, and he could begin speaking again. Did they forget their golden mantles? Worthless. Bound in the garden of the parasite. Bastard. He had to give applause to Robut. His various names for the Lord of Flies were absolute artistry. Calling the one who styled himself a loving father, a bastard that sunders loving houses through unending consumption, was quite a well-struck blow. He would naturally steal it in a shameless manner, bound and tormented, but alive. Isha is alive. It is our duty as her children to rescue and defend her. He left no room for disagreement with his declaration. It is our duty to carve a red path through that bilesome heap, pull her from it, and preserve her against she who thirsts. We can do nothing less. Then why do we delay? Merchant Prince in red, black and white shouted out. Why do we wait while she lies in torment? How many of the assembled are warriors? Asanil questioned. How many among you are warriors and not toy makers? Not painters, not merchants, not poets, not performers. Warriors. Only a third stood. The majority of them were Exodites. To his credit, the merchant prince remained standing, a clave at his hip. He looked around, though, and frowned in grim black before sitting down once more. We have not the number of warriors required, not only to face the boundless armies of the parasite, but also the boundless armies of she who thirsts, as well as keep Isha safe while we retrieve her. Nor do we have a psychic stronghold sturdy enough to keep her protected as she regains strength. Asanil spoke the facts plainly to the assembled. We need more warriors, we need more war material, we need new lands, we need stronger wards. We need all of these things and more if we are to fulfill our duty. And you would have us ally with vermin. A merchant prince in cream and green sneered out. Asanil turned a red gaze upon them, even as they continued. Creatures of flesh and iron, wielding technology of the materium and covering their worlds in dung. Asanil attempted to keep his calm. If you are here, then you had the vision shared with you. The vision is lies. To believe that the Empire of Eld could be brought low by screaming dods. You would have us rely on animals to secure our future. Shall we send cattle to war next? The Empire of Eld has brought itself low, Asanil roared, ignoring all warnings we attempted to provide, deciding to debase itself for nearly an age until birthing a brand new extinction. This isn't what we wanted. A new god to lead us to greater heights. This is not what was promised, a refugee prince declared in desperation, much to the sudden swelling of red in the chamber. This is what you desired. A new god to indulge itself in every sensation imaginable, doing exactly what your wretched urbanite kind did to all other things. An exodite, Lord called out furiously. You deserve your extinction, bringing it upon yourself. Enough. Gold weighed down on the chamber, smothering all emotions beneath it. A set of footsteps echoed. Wraithbone boots stepped into the center of the theater, next to Asanil. The Exodus Lord, eyes and crown jewels shining as stars, stood among the assembled eld. I will not let the many-fathered bastard goddess of gutter whores devour our sweet mother. I will not allow our sweet mother to remain in the captivity of the spite, smiling dung-devouring intestine, Ouroboros. This I swear upon 7 dead gods. This I swear upon a people in ruins. This I swear upon a red-handed soul. The weight of gold receded slightly, allowing the rest of them to breathe and move once more. Asanil turned his gaze to Malekith, whose eyes shone in slight apology for the breach in etiquette. Asanil nodded in thanks and moved to sit next to Roboute on the side. Nodding at his weathered statue friend, he turned his gaze to the Exodus Lord. Malekith Malon regarded his assembled kin with heat on his brow. Waiting the perfect length, he began to speak. Discount all considerations of white cycles. Consider only golden truth. Our core worlds have been consumed by a catastrophe. Our souls are now at risk of being devoured if we relax our minds for even a moment. Only 3/10 of our fleets are present among us, if that. Our only remaining safe homes are the Exodite worlds, which cannot support a dedicated military effort on their own. Staying upon them, behind the aegis of the world spirits, will only mean a slower death. Our cycle of reincarnation is shattered. Perhaps only a handful of the old kings of Eld remain among us. No more will be reborn afterwards. No more will remember the old glories once they fall. We will only diminish and die after this, and our future will be ash. If we fail, our strength is our gods. Segarak lives hidden in the webways and far beyond us. Kaini lives shattered, scattered throughout the wheel. Isha lives, and is whole, in captivity. We must bring them to strength once more. We must build a safe place for them to gather power. We must protect our gods, to protect ourselves from the disaster of our own making. Here we have the godling of a fledgling race. He has come to our worlds with the message of our living mother. He has come with oaths on his soul to rescue her. He asks for nothing but friendship and aid in completing his oath. He asks for nothing from us but what we need, allies. What foolishness would be to turn him away, even without the prophecy of doom. We have a godling prince willing to stake his soul on aiding our mother, and we consider sending him away? They had a name for this kind of foolishness, but Segarach outwitted the deceiver long ago. We are not submitting to his yoke. We are gaining a friend. Are you to sneer at offers of friendship? Friendship cannot be held between greaters and lessers. A wizened and loathing voice declared softly. A core world prince, with studs of bone in his forehead and burning red in his eyes. Only equals. Are you to declare us equal with this infant species? Yes. Malekith met the core world prince's gaze with eyes of green and blazing brow. What power do refugees that are prey to their own new god have? Nothing if they stand alone. I name you a liar, another core world prince declared. Then come down and cut out my tongue. You have a sword, do you not? Not just a whip, Malekith returned, reaching down to rest his hand on the hilt of his blade. A terrible, blazing red heat issuing from his gentle grip. A golden circle slowly beginning to form on his brow and behind his head as his spirit stones began to glow. You are a gold-browed, red-armed warrior, are you not? You wear the skins of gods and a crown of stars, do you not? Able to yoke the wheel and turn it in any direction unobstructed? Silence was his answer, for it was quite unfashionable to carry swords in the core worlds. Malekith continued after a moment. It will be difficult. There is a long road of work before us if we are to regain our former glory. There is much refuse that must be cleared away from the path, and many spirits that seek to consume us along the way. Our time of excess is over. We cannot afford to indulge any longer. Now is a time of struggles. Now is a time of labours. The path I see before us is littered with corpses, littered with luxuries discarded, littered with compromises made. But I see friendships made. I see children born. I see happy descendants and a noble kingdom. I see a castle built of white and gold next to a sea of blue, guarded by warriors of red and green, supplied by craftsmen of black and sorcerers of many colours. I see a many-coloured rainbow and the path we must take to reach it. I see our three living gods in those halls. I see them strong and whole. Malekith's face grew dim, and the heat on his brow intensified like a newborn sun. The world spirit was garbed in gold for just a moment. I see the corpse of Slaanesh. Fusha crashed into a dragon made of ghosts and armoured in gold. An ocean of thirst slamming into wraithwings. Eyes of excess hungering at a glare of green. The gold flashed. The wings extended. The tide broke. Shaking, Eld slowly pushed themselves up, eyes flashing in desperate fear. The Exodus Lord stood unbowed, crowned in stars and gold. I see the path before us. I will reach out my hand in friendship to the godling of a young race. Who among you will follow me? There was a long silence in the chamber. Asanil stood. I am, for he had already offered his hand in friendship. Another Dragon Lord stood. I will, then another. I will, then dozens more. I will, then thousands more. I will, then their entirety, speaking even if they didn't believe in it. I will. Malekith regarded them for a while longer, before slowly nodding and turning his head to steadfast Roboute, unfazed by the presence of the goddess, for he had arms of gold. Son of man, slayer of evil, friend of the Eldar, rise and speak if you would. We seek your war council. Roboute rose, took up the foldable table he called it, and the psychic projector. He had learned how to control it as his first lesson, much to Asanil's dismay. Walking to the center of the theater, he regarded the assembled Eld for a moment before unfolding the table, placing the projector upon it and focusing his mind. A massive map burst to life in the center of the chamber, upon which 10,000 data points were listed and elaborated upon extensively, upon which 100,000 or more hours have been poured into creating and revising again and again. On the side of this map, a dozen more notes burst into life and began to slowly scroll. And in the center of the room, Roboute began to explain his vast plans in full, the sum of his King Star shining on his brow. 3 things will be required for the rescue and continued safeguarding of Goddess Isha. A staging ground near the Eye of Terra from which to launch the attack and prevent its further expansion in the meantime. A vast and mobile military to launch the attack, retrieve her, and escape. And a territory sufficiently warded and powerful enough to protect her within as she recovers and gains strength. This is our first objective to prepare for. There are a total of 7 calamities to come in the next 10,000 years that I am aware of. I will elaborate upon them after the details of the first objective are known and sufficiently debated upon. Asanil almost sighed. He knew all of this already, which means he was just going to be sitting here for another 9 hours. No, the machine worshippers were quick and efficient with their questioning. These were Eldar, 18 hours at minimum. She preferred this tutor over her previous. The previous one, Rastalin, was far more competent than the tutors of her earliest childhood on Olympia, but it only took a scant few months to exhaust what he knew about the sciences of the materium. She contented herself with learning other things in the meantime, waiting for Brother to deliver her the tutor he promised. Eventually, after some years and a meeting with the machine priests, one that took entirely too long to stand through, he had fulfilled his promise. She knew he would, there was no doubt. Magos Calculatus was a short man, average. A voice in the back of her mind whispered, "We're just very tall," who was mostly metal by weight. His armor was weakest in the groin and joints, but would still require more force than she could muster by herself to break at the moment. She did not know how he managed that. She intended to learn. His visor was another weak point, but stronger than his joints. He knew much more about the workings of the material world than Rastalin, even if he had his own annoying habits as well. She said she would do her best to learn, which meant dealing with annoying habits. She was not Morrigan, who would spitefully complain about something while she did it. She was the eldest sister, which means she needed to be the best sister, so she would be polite and learn. She stared at the servo skull in her hands. The Magos had brought a selection of human skulls with him to teach her how to produce one. She had gotten the process correct with the first skull, perfected with the second skull, and now her mind whirled with visions of how to improve it. Excellently done. Your second, Griffon pattern familiar, is complete, although you shall need implants to commune with it properly. That can wait for you to finish your growth period. Magos calculator spoke, looking over her shoulder at her work. Your previous tutors did well to instill knowledge of the most basic truths. I should speak to them at some point. Why a skull? She found herself asking, staring at the thing in her hands. Human bone wasn't a particularly durable substance. Surely plasteel or wraith bone would be better. The manipulators also weren't particularly reinforced or powerful, and she knew she could improve both. With improved servos, it was practically all one weak point. Nothing here would resist a man with a hammer. I could elaborate upon the spiritual significance, but such is not needed here. The most practical truth is that skulls serve as a convenient housing for the machinery, harvestable from our own fallen, of roughly correct proportions, and requiring no manufacturing lines to produce. A cost-saving measure. It's weak, she said, turning it over in her hands and gripping the bone. She could crush it without much effort. Too fragile, too easy to shatter. Indeed, just as man is weak, that does not make it useless. She turned her attention to the Magos, sensing a lesson oncoming. He scratched at his short beard with one hand, gesturing at the skull with the other. Tell me, student, what is the function of this machine? This model is secretarial. Transportation of documents and messages, recording of information, projection of recordings. She listed, turning her gaze back to it for a moment. Looking at its manipulator claws, its pict recorder, its image projector. It contains a basic machine spirit, anti-grave engine, and battery. It is housed in osseous tissue. Is it a combat unit? No. She frowned, although she could easily see how to modify it to be such. Are any of the components in short supply or difficult to assemble? No. No. She finished, looking at the fragile thing in her hands. A bode, too, carved into its side. She didn't imagine skulls to be very difficult to gather upon a world of humans. Nor were any of the components difficult to put together if you had the refineries already established and metals being actively extracted from Earth. Therein lies its value. Many hundreds of thousands of such devices are in service. Each and every one could be made with the most durable and effective materials. But how much more would those materials cost on that scale? Would the exchange of rare materials and increased labor be worth the potential increase in individual durability and effectiveness? I can improve it without either of those things, she confidently stated, looking at the skull and reviewing its schematics in her mind. Eliminating all her ideas for how to improve it in ways that cost more time, skill, or materials, she still had some left. Oh? The Magos sounded intrigued, reaching up to scratch his chin again. The design is assembled from merely basic truths. Very well. If you can improve the design without increasing the cost of manufacture, I'm eager to see it. I'll send a copy of the finished schematics back to Griffon if you are successful. I will be, she said, looking at the skull in her hand. Frowning, she raised her head and looked at him. You said to remember the 16th law at the start. Why aren't you mad? She figured he would be angry at her declaration, that she could improve an established design. The Magos hummed in understanding, moving over to retrieve a data slate and sitting down on the opposite side of the table from her. Please recite Universal Law 13, 15, and 16. The knowledge of the ancients is beyond question. Flesh is fallible, but ritual honors the machine's spirit. To break with ritual is to break with faith. She dutifully spoke the laws she didn't particularly believe in. She had no reason to put faith in some god. Her brother was going to fight two gods to rescue a third. Worshipping a god seemed quaint compared to him. Have I explained the difference between basic truths and higher truths yet? He mused aloud, scanning through memory banks before coming to a conclusion. No, I don't believe I have. A failure on my part. We shall correct that now. The sum of any two numbers is the sum of those two numbers. This is a self-referential law. It is based on nothing but itself. But it is something that can clearly be observed in the universe. 2 and 2 will always equal 4. It is foundational, it is self-evident, it is something that the most basic sapients can observe. It is not built on any prior law, but it is demonstrably truth. This is one of the most basic truths. There are many basic truths. Many of the most essential are observable by any basic sapient. Fire is hot compared to us. Ice is cold compared to us. Gravitic force pulls us to large objects. These things have more complex mathematical truths, but their practical effects remain to all who see. The wiring of a data slate is complex to a layman, but to one who comprehends enough basic truths of motive force, it is also a basic truth. Now, do you know what a Hermes array is? She shook her head in denial. The Magos nodded, expecting such an answer, and continued. A Hermes array is a large machine that can connect 2 points in material space, allowing for information to be sent across while the points are connected. This allows faster, the light communications without the use of psychic technologies. Do you know how it connects 2 points in material space? She shook her head no again, and he nodded. None alive do. What? She furrowed her brow. You just told me how it works. I told you what the priesthood of Griffon knows of the device and its function. We know of it from scattered recordings found in destroyed facilities and the half-destroyed complex on one of our vassal worlds. It is non-functional. We do not know how to repair it, for we have none to teach us the truths required to reach it any longer. It is a mystery, and we have no path to it. A higher truth is in between a mystery and a basic truth. We know how to keep the machine functional. We know how to repair it, and in optimal scenarios, we can even build more of the machine. But the basic truths required to comprehend it are lost to us. We can only perform the rituals handed down to us, preserved by our forebears, established truths that have long been mapped. But a higher truth cannot become a basic truth until enough requisite basic truths are known to us. Truth is a ladder we seek to ascend, for comprehension is divinity, but too much was lost in the age of strife. We may never truly comprehend again, so we must perform the rituals, we must have faith in the machine. The Omnisire knows all, comprehends all. We perform rituals and await his arrival, for he will lead us to understanding again. That is all we can do anymore. Why not try to understand again? It was done before, she questioned, staring at the skull in her hands. We cannot afford to. Calculators shook his head sadly. The age of technology was long ago, and too much of the galaxy has been ravaged already. We can pray for a golden age to come, in which understanding can be reached again, in which we can afford to learn once more. But we cannot plan for it to arrive, for we do not know. To seek understanding in the destructive manner required may waste resources needed to survive, something we cannot afford in such a dangerous age. All we can do is perform the preserved rituals and keep faith that the machines will endure for another day. My brother will make an empire big enough to protect everyone. Father is working on the same. She spoke with absolute conviction. The priesthood is certainly hopeful of such. The Magos replied with a small smile on his face. If the galaxy can be made safe enough for comprehension to be reached once more, it will be a most holy place indeed. He nodded at the servo skull in her hands. A servo skull is composed of basic truths. Attempting to innovate its construction is something most apprentices attempt at some point. There is nothing lost by this. The experience can only be helpful to your own development. His visor glowed a happy yellow, and should you succeed and make something truly exceptional, there will be a most wonderful blessing to receive. You are intelligent and dutiful. I am confident in your ability and eagerly await your finished work. Yes, Petra liked her current tutor. Even if he made her recite prayers that she didn't believe in, she could tolerate doing so just fine. The understanding within is absolutely remarkable. This is a most blessed tome, the Magos said, looking at the book that her brother handed to him, flipping through pages with a delicate hand. The terminology is foreign in some places, but the attached lexicon is more than sufficient for comprehension. You said this came from your father, Malum Kaido? Penned by the hand of his close friend, but yes. He sent it as a gift recently. Can you ensure its contents are copied at least 9 times, sending a few copies to Griffon? I would like to ensure its knowledge is not lost. Her brother replied, raising a hand with a palm facing upwards. I'll copy it 12 times more than that. Then I'll have my retinue copy it 12 times more than that. The Magos promised, visor whirling as he looked through the pages of the tome. It will most likely take a day per copy, a week if done by hand. I shall get my entire retinue working on it. She bent down slightly, sneakily as she could, to read the title of the book in his hands. Frontier Class, War Walker, Technical Breakdown and Service Manual for use in Class 2500 models. Recorded by Certified Walker Mechanic and Operator Brahm K. She wanted to read it. The weakest point was along its spine. Thank you. In the meantime, I understand that you know how to repair Imperial Knights? Yes, we have a vassal world with such wondrous machines. They are useful aids in learning how to repair Titans without as grievous a risk. Carl Calculatus replied, not looking up from the book, visor focused intently upon it. I will have need of your services soon then. We are approaching the first night world within the hour. Brother spoke, nodding at him. Carl nodded back, still engrossed in the tome. Brother smiled in an amused fashion before shaking his head. Why don't you go start the first copy now, Magos? I'll call for you when the time comes. Of course, by your leave, Malum Cado. Carl spoke quickly, almost running off to his chambers with the manual in hand. Holding it like it was a delicate something, maybe a baby, they watched him run off, metal boots making a distinct sound as they hit the bone floors of the ship. The weakest point of the ship was off in the distance. Her brother turned his gaze to her. She stood up straight and properly as she could at the attention. She was the eldest, so she had to be the most proper sister. His weakest point was the neck and a heart. The weakest point on his armor was the groin and joints. I'll be off for a little while. I don't expect they'll attempt to attack us, but there will likely be a few hours of diplomatic talks before formal swears of allegiance. Then maybe a week to get everything set up on this world before we move on. Make sure everyone goes to sleep at the proper times if I'm not back in time, okay? She nodded most seriously. He could rely on her to do this. She was the eldest sister. He smiled at her before pulling her into a hug. She took her own arms, now just barely big enough to wrap all the way around him, and squeezed. The wraithbone flexed under her strength, and he hugged back. She liked hugs. This was a low-quality hug because there was armor in the way. She still liked it. He pulled back, much to her disappointment. Are your lessons still going well? She nodded. I have learned all fundamentals of the quadrivium and have begun the practical lessons. I made servo skulls yesterday. Her brother paused for a moment before nodding. Servo skulls. Did he say where he got the skulls? Magos Carl said he brought them from Griffon. Ah, well that's good then. I have named them, she elaborated. He blinked and raised a brow. Named the servo skulls? Yes, they are named Maiden, Ina, and Dio. Maiden is a monotask model. Ina is a pict recorder and display. Dio is a sensor. I have to order them verbally because I don't have the implants to directly communicate yet. Brother evaluated that for a moment before nodding his head in consideration. Have you considered taking psycho lessons with your sisters? If you learn how to communicate telepathically, you should be able to order them without the need for implants. D. Did he not like her getting implants? Was there something wrong with them? She felt a spike of embarrassment that she spoke of something so stupid. She made a mistake in assuming something without permission. She was an idiot. She looked down. Okay, hey now, Brother said, leaning down slightly to put a hand on her shoulder and look her in the eyes. If you want to get the implants, you can. I was simply making sure you were aware of another route that I saw. No, I'll go to the lessons, she said firmly. If it was a route he suggested, then it was the right route. His power made him good at planning, so she would listen to him, even if that meant having to take the lessons with Aurelia and Cassandra. Aurelia was fine. She was inoffensive. Petra needed to make sure she grew up well, because she was definitely younger. She was just big when she arrived, which wasn't fair, but Petra was already almost taller anyways. Cassandra was also learning psycho lessons, but those were about seeing the future, or something along those lines. Cassandra and Aurelia were fine. They could be trusted to not cause brother problems. Morrigan had learned her lesson, but Petra was watching her. If her sister was about to mess up again, she'd step in. Petra was the eldest sister, after all. She had to help her brother with these things. All right, if you wish. I'll be back when I get the affairs of the planet in order. What's its name? She asked, suddenly curious. Jedathra, home to High Knight House, Herpatrax, and a few vassal houses. I want to see the knights, she forced out. Before we leave, Brother smiled and messed up her hair. I think our schedule allows that. I'll see you again soon. Rising to his full height, he turned to leave, grabbing his cloak as he left the chamber and moving through the doorway, leaving her alone for the moment. She looked down at the table for a moment, lost in observing it and its flaws. Its most vulnerable point was its legs. She frowned, noticing something. Walking over, she moved the table to be correctly aligned with the wall once more, it having deviated at some point. She stepped back, only to then notice another deviation with the chair. Correcting this, she noticed another deviation, and her frown deepened. Stepping back, she took in the room as a whole. Its most vulnerable points were in the edges and seams. This room was low quality. She hated it. Turning, she left the room. She wanted to distract herself from thinking about it any more. She decided to show her servo skulls to Miriel. Miriel was nice and taught her many things. She would be proud to see Petra's progress in materium sciences. You have eyes behind your eyes, and they are cracked open in fear. Poor child, listen to my lullaby. Be restful, be calm. You can rest here, but this is a safe place. No evils will reach you. Those were the last words she heard before falling into her first true sleep. Stomach full, eyes heavy, body washed and wrapped in warm linens. She was unable to resist the pull of sleep in the arms of the long-eared woman who held her. Her dreams did not foretell the miseries of the next day, only warm food and restful repose. Stares from her chubby-cheeked sister, a crown of feathers from a great beast, and the protective arms of her savior brother. They were very good dreams. She awoke the next day to a plate of fresh food, being brought to her by the same long-eared woman that held her until she slept the day previous. She had sharp green eyes and long white hair, tied in a bun. Her name was Headmaid Miriel, she said, and Cassandra swore she wouldn't forget. She looked at her and saw her dying on a bed, a smile on her face, white sheets stained red about her. It was a very gentle-looking death. Cassandra preferred it over any she had seen before. She let her eat her fill, then led Cassandra to her savior brother, who spoke gently and offered his fingers for her to grip. She held on and refused to let go until it was time to sleep again. She could not see how he died. She is very happy about this. She met her sister, who looked about ferociously but never moved to harm. She brought Cassandra before the dragons and demanded feathers from their crests for her. She refused to look at Petra so she would not have to see how she died. She met Stormcloak Arshal, who taught her how to control her visions and how to hold blades. He taught her what all kinds of weapons were and what parts you should aim at to cut properly. She saw him ripped apart by screaming claws, a defiant roar on his face as he swung at it with a shining sword. You have eyes behind your eyes. They are cracked open. You must imagine them closed. And so she did, and the visions were gone unless she wanted them, and she cried for many hours that day. Miriel held her again and sang the lullaby. She met Dragon Lord Asarnil, who did amusing things like flick olives at her so she could catch them in her mouth. Olives were not tasty, they were bitter. She still ate them. They were much better than dead meat. She did not have to see how he died, so she did not. She met Aurelia, who cried a lot for many months, so Cassandra allowed herself to be hugged and hummed the lullaby that Miriel sang for her. She had been helped once, so she had to help in turn. Aurelia needed help. She did not have to see how she died, so she did not. She met Morrigan, who was angry and suspicious. She had caused Brother Savior to be hurt, and she was going to demand punishment. Then Brother Savior forgave her, so Cassandra forgave her too. Now Morrigan helped her learn about cutting things, so Cassandra would let herself be hugged and hummed the lullaby for her. Morrigan needed help too. She did not have to see how she died, so she did not. She had met many good people in the last 4 years. She had met no good people in the bad place. She would do everything she could to keep them safe and healthy. It was only fair. A warp storm is approaching this system. Can you feel it? Arshal spoke in Eldar. Speak as they went through the gentle rhythms of combat. Stance, strike, stance, strike. She shook her head. No, blocking another attack and attempting a counter. It was a war dance, he called it. Both warriors performed their part in the dance and kept their blades sharp by it. Cassandra liked dancing, her feet stepping on the ground, her arms flowing into swings, blades clashing with bell-like noises. Dancing was good. Open your ears and listen to the low rumble, the low whistle. Can you hear it? She focused, blades clashing again and again as she did so, and her ears behind her ears strained to listen. A sound like blood, pools lapping against stone walls, or foul-smelling cleaners washing against bodies. A rhythmic and gentle crash of liquid on barrier, and underneath that she fell into rhythm as the sound of a low, inevitable rumble filled her second ears. The clash of blades in an unexpected burst pulled her from that sound, and she nodded at Stormcloak Arshal. That means our foresight will be less predictable here. Once it was filtered through Goddess Lilith, but she is gone now. Now we must manage the false colors of the unskilled painter. Who? She asked, ducking beneath a swing in time with her part in the dance and swinging back in turn. Arshal ducked in turn as she was finally tall enough for that pattern in the dance to emerge, one of the four. The self-proclaimed changer of ways. Morai, Heg and Segarak made it their business to make mockery of all his labors, for he deserves nothing less. He is the mockingbird that mutters at random, no conclusion drawn from the words he copies. He will attempt to interfere with your sight, especially when the warp is strongly present. She hummed in reply, a small trail of sweat dripping down her brow as the dance continued to accelerate in tempo. Clash, 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 clash. She was not using her second sight here. Dancing was to keep the body firm and limber. Using second sight would turn the dance into something else, so it was avoided. Hour 3 was the hardest part of the dance anyways. Stormcloak Arshal claimed it was the hardest to get used to, and that it took him many years. He was still sweating more than she was. She was stronger at this point, even if he was more practiced. Arshal hummed in turn, focusing on the war dance for another long period. The last minute of clashing required the most focus, so much that she could barely keep up. Clash, 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 dodge, clash, weave, clash, 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 dodge, dodge, dodge. They pushed back from one another, and her mentor let out a long, slow breath. She did the same, starting the cool-down period with much more basic and restrained dance fighting. This was just to prevent a cramp of the muscles, movement that did not strain the muscles, but kept them loose. We shall have to change your weaponry. Arshal spoke suddenly. She hummed in, questioning. He continued. Your arms keep twitching to use both limbs. Your instinctive response is still one of clawing and swiping. You're more suited for a pair of shorter blades than a single standard-length weapon. He did not sound angry at this, and yet according to his words, she had wasted much of his time learning a non-optimal fighting style. This was unbalanced. She would learn twice as fast to make up for this. I see, she replied, moving through the motions and feeling muscles slowly unstrain with the movement. Movement felt good. Worry not. I think you'll take to it well. Now for the next part of the lesson. Cast your sight to the world below. Tell me what you see your lord brother doing. He backed away, allowing her to continue the movements without distraction. She opened the eyes behind her eyes and focused her thoughts on an image. An image was important, Arshal had taught her, required to focus one's gaze upon a subject. It was why her cracked open eyes foresaw those she looked upon with first eyes, because of the image. It was that image that she cast her sight upon, and the world below was how restrained she let her gaze be. Her halo of gentle gold was there, in a sea of greens and blues and reds. She focused her gaze further upon it and confirmed that it was her brother. Then she looked upon it and let her eyes wander forwards, or maybe beyond. It was an angle she couldn't describe except in the uncertain descriptor of further away. Arshal had called it the White Road, a thing that stretched on forever, even if you couldn't see it clearly. It was the future, she knew, something that would happen later, unless something was changed. Arshal had made sure she knew that quickly, reassured by her brother and any other eldar she spoke to. Common wisdom, they called it. Visions are never reliable. There are many things within the wheel we cannot see on the White Road, and these things will alter outcomes they come into contact with. Our second sight can only be an advisor, and never a king, for it often lies. She looked to the future her brother walked upon, and began to speak it aloud. He will fall from the ship at a great height, cracking stone with his landing. He will stride to the keep, announcing his intentions, while ignoring the presence of the warriors brandishing swords at him. He will open the gates on his own, and march into the halls of their queen. They have banners with a frilled serpent upon it. Their colors are green and gold. She furrowed her brows, tasting the sight. He will announce his name and intention. The woman on the throne will demand a test of brothers' mettle, a duel against their mightiest warrior, who pilots a knight. The queen will be surprised when brother declares he will fight the knight on foot, for he needs no war machine. The duel will be hosted within an hour. The champion is their executioner. She pilots a tall machine with a flame weapon and a chain blade. Brother will defeat her in 3 minutes, topping her machine and carving the woman out of her seat. The queen will insist on more duels. She frowned. That was unfair. Brother will defeat a dozen knights before the knights, dames turn on their queen. Brother will intervene and have her spared. She will bow and offer her crown, and he will refuse it. They will discuss terms for the rest of the night. She frowned harder at what she saw next. She will garb herself in thin silks and attempt to brush against him many times. He will ignore her touch. He will return to the ship several hours after dinner. Good, now return to the face of the second night. Dame your brother defeats. What does she look like? She hummed, and returned her sight to that moment. Green eyes and red hair. Arshal hummed himself, a tune she didn't recognize, and timed out several long moments before speaking again. Now go through the vision again. She did so, reciting it throughout just like before. It was all the same from what she could tell. Number. There was something off, but she couldn't distinguish what at the moment. Check the face of the second woman again. She did so. Blue eyes and red hair. A frown grew on her face as she realized that didn't correlate with her previous vision. This is the result of the coming storm. It is weak now, but soon it will engulf this system and make visions quite unreliable. A webway gate will likely be constructed here the following morning to ensure travel between this place and Charnak, a means of ensuring loyalty and continued communication. She stared at the woman on the throne. The queen is unjust. She should be discarded. Arshal laughed. She frowned. She wasn't intending on making a joke. She was pretending to sleep. Petra was insistent upon it. Cassandra noted that she specified in bed and not asleep, however, giving her a window to act within. Her sight was active, taking note of the steps her brother was taking, quietly frowning at the woman he was trying to talk to. She was attempting to manipulate him. It was unjust. He called an end to the meeting after finishing an outline of his plans for the world. She smiled as the queen hid a small frown behind her hand, and brother stepped away, ducking through the tiny doors to the outside. He raised his sword once in the courtyard again and made it burn. The warriors around him flinched and exclaimed. He stepped through the webway gate that appeared before him and onto the floor of the hangar. He gave a large sigh and rubbed the back of his neck in frustration, nodding to the eldar who were present and readying for tomorrow. Opening her first eyes, she took stock of the room. The others were asleep. Aurelia snored at that large feline creature curled up on her chest. Petra grumbled and chewed on her pillow. Morrigan was completely still, aside from light, shallow breaths. Cassandra slowly extracted herself, stepping with only her toes at first, and muffling her movement with the thinner silks she pretended to prefer sleeping under. Her weight settling on the floor, she moved her weight onto 3 limbs at a time and rolled the points of contact as she moved. She was the best at creeping around. She's had lots of practice. Moving forward, she slowly muffled the door handle with the silks and opened it, slipping out of the doorway and into the hall under a cloak of bedsheets. She closed the door shut again, and she was free. Petra would be upset if she found out, so it was best to not let Petra find out. She turned and froze, seeing the narrow green eyes in the darkness. Muriel, carrying a stack of papers and ink, staring at her from the intersection at the end of the hall. Muriel's ears split forwards, an invitation to approach. Cassandra slowly creeped forwards until she was next to Muriel. "Going to see your brother?" Muriel whispered a question, not revealing her thoughts on the matter. Cassandra nodded, and Muriel's ears flickered in thought for a moment. Her eyes glanced upwards, and then back down to Cassandra. "Only for a little while, then you must return to slumber. Understand? Your brother has work to do." Cassandra nodded quickly in acceptance, pulling the bedsheet around her as she moved up to be practically flush with the head maid, who nodded promptly and began to walk forwards again. The two of them walked through mostly empty and quiet halls, a comfortable silence between the two. Eventually they reached her brother's room, and Muriel knocked on the door. "Come in," her brother answered from within. Opening the door for Muriel, Cassandra slipped through first and closed the door behind the maid. Turning, she saw brother rubbing his temple in frustration, papers and fresh ink set before him. She stayed still as he spoke. "Thank you, Miriel. I suspect I shall have to change my strategy for getting the damn primarchs to listen. She's quite the social climber. Someone is here to see you, honored one." Miriel returned, ear flickering over to her. Brother blinked, looking up at the maid before looking over at her. Cassandra slunk up quickly, climbing upon his legs and settling into a hug. He huffed in amusement. "You're getting much too big for this, Cassandra. Soon you'll be as tall as me, and this will be very inconvenient." She hummed a denial. He kept speaking. "I asked Petra to make sure you all got to bed. I suppose you ignored the implication of going to sleep until I returned." She hummed an agreement. He sighed permissively, reaching up to hug her for a moment, before turning to Miriel to continue speaking. As he did so, he reached past her for his quill and ink, starting to scratch out notes on the table and speak his thoughts aloud to the maid, who occasionally offered feedback in low, soft voices. Cassandra finally let herself go to sleep. This was a good place. She had seen visions of him coming, golden halo and burning blade. He came for her and took her away and punished those that had her. But he didn't punish her for letting them hurt her. She allowed it to happen. It was her fault that she was spoiled. But he wouldn't punish her, because he loved her. Because he came from the heavens and smote them, smote so many of them, had her cleaned and fed and swaddled her in warm sheets. He carried her away from that place. She hadn't been punished for letting them touch her. He knew that they touched her and that she let them, and he didn't punish her. He held her and spoke gently and promised to give her anything she needed, anything she wanted. She had been passed over because he loved her and didn't want to punish her. Each night she slept with that thought in mind, a warm smile on her face, hidden under the covers he gave her. She had to give back. It was greedy, sinful, to only take. She had to give in return. But she was a weak and foolish girl. She knew so little. So she had to learn. So she selfishly asked for more, and he gave it to her. She asked to learn. She wanted to learn everything, because she couldn't give anything unless she knew something. So to give everything, she had to learn. Everything. She learned so much, so very much. And there was still so much more to learn. He taught her about himself. He taught her about the galaxy and the things within. He taught her about the immaterial world, about the gods and their servants, about how he was going to make war with them because he was strong enough to do so, mighty enough to speak of fighting gods and winning because he was the son of their father. Petra told her what brother told her about father. The eldar told her about the light in the galaxy. If she strained her ears enough to listen and eyes enough to see, she could hear it. In the quietest and darkest parts of the night, with her eyes closed and no sound around her, there was a faint golden light on the horizon and a murmur of choir song. That was her father, a man like her brother, mighty enough to make war on gods, like men make war on men. They loved her. The thoughts made her smile wobbly and head feel light. She was rotten. Great scholar Raistlin taught her how to read and write in several languages, taught her the nature of the immaterial and the gods within, taught her the histories of the wheel of all the peoples he knew within it, taught her arithmetic, geometry, poetry, several instruments, what he knew of engineering and materium sciences, and so much more. Stormcloak Arshel taught her to focus her mind, to channel her psychic energies and talents, to close herself off from whispers within the sea of souls, taught her how to use the blade, hammer, halberd, and gun, taught her how to exercise and maintain her equipment. Headmaid servant Miriel taught her to wash and dry clothing, taught her and her sisters how to cook and clean properly, taught them how to read mannerisms and speak properly, taught her how to present herself as a proper lady. And Lord Brother taught her how to rule, how to look at all things before you, at all things that you had, and use them to their fullest effect. How to plan and think, how to prepare and when to act, how to make war. He taught her about themselves and their people, about the histories of the wheel as he knew it, about anything and everything she could think to ask. She was learning so much, and yet there was so much more to learn. With each thing she learned, she had more to repay him. She would become everything he needed to pay him back. He told her she could do anything she wanted to learn how to do, but that wasn't true. She knew the truth. He loved her too much to punish her like she deserved. She was taking advantage of him, shamelessly, selfishly. She loved him. She was rotten. She'd be the perfect aide, because he deserved nothing less than her everything. So she had to learn more, so she could be more useful. Meow. The fluffy creature in her lap let out as he got up to rotate and flop down again in a slightly different position. She smiled warmly, looking down at him. His name was Urizen, wisest of the wise. She had been allowed to go to the kennels of Gyrinx while on Charnak. Gyrinx were not owned, rather they chose to own someone in turn. She was now the apparent pet to a ball of fluff that wanted treats and scratches. It was quite the predicament. Whatever shall she do? She reached down and rubbed against the back of the juvenile Gyrinx's ear. Urizen let out another murraw as he leaned into her fingers. Urizen was an acceptable master, she supposed. He was generous and gave her shed hair, gentle bites, and annoyed looks whenever she moved around too much. Urizen jumped slightly, poking his head up to the sound of distant cheers and the clang of metal footsteps on stony ground. She looked up in turn, resisting the urge to fidget with her new dress. This world was resisting her brother's efforts to conquer them, for the day after he spoke with their queen and dominated their knightesses, challenger knights from across the land were beginning to make their way to the capital. The queen had apparently offended many by bowing, countering her own house words of, "We do not bow." Hilarious. So brother decided to accelerate the process and bring every challenger directly to him through the webway for duels outside the capital. His plan was simple: defeat every challenger in the world, one after another, and force them all to kneel to him. Once that was done, he would proceed with his plans of integration, recruitment, and negotiating the repair of their knights. She knew he could. He was strong after all. Stronger than anything these war machines could muster against him in a duel. He was strong enough to destroy cities, overthrow sorcerer kings, and duel dozens of stormcloaks at a time. He would defeat them, then he would save them, and they would serve him very well. They're garbage. Elder Sister Petra spoke, wearing her own new dress and staring at the weathered war machines with a deeper than usual frown, practically falling apart at the joints. "Please be kind, sister." Aurelia spoke gently. "They have not the expertise of our allies in the priesthood." Petra grunted in an unsatisfied manner, indicating that she was already trying to be polite. Aurelia smiled indulgently and pet Urizen again. Urizen was currently having a contest of wills with Cassandra, staring unblinking at her and her staring back. Their queen is useless. Morrigan spoke her mind, causing Aurelia to give a stern look in turn, even as Petra grunted in agreement. Morrigan, with her own dress of green and gold, continued speaking. She saw him arrive, demanded an unfair duel, was unbalanced that he won, then failed to seduce him. She tried to eliminate him through a proxy, failed, tried to tie herself to the new power, failed, and is now letting her vassals run rampant instead of reeling them in. I don't know how she got the crown. Morrigan finished off, ignoring the herald in the distance, announcing the upcoming events to the assembled citizens and nobility watching from the stands. There were 50 knights assembled, practically a war front on its own, and most of which were standing offline to the side of the massive arena. The assembled knight pilots were mostly lounging nearby, staring at her lord brother, who stood undaunted in the center of the arena. She noticed that most of the knight pilots were female, with reddish hair. A matriarchy, perhaps? Or just a random occurrence? Oh, already figured that part out? An unfamiliar voice called. The four sisters turned their head to see a new woman entering their tent, allowed in by the Stormcloak guards. That meant her mind had already been read and intentioned, determined as non-hostile, so she was relatively safe to be around. Aurelia noticed Stormcloak Arshal slip silently behind the woman, ready to put her down if the situation called for it. The woman was tall for a human, but much shorter than any of the sisters, with scarlet hair tied back in a functional ponytail and a lone green eye staring at them. The other eye hidden behind a patch and marked by a great scar that trailed up her scalp. She was clad in colourful gambeson, her left sleeve tied off at the shoulder, indicating a missing limb. Then long cream-coloured hose on her legs, and then leather riding boots on her feet. You got it right, giant girl. My sister is completely useless and can't rein in her vassals. That's why she's on the throne. Ah, the vassals allow her to keep token power, allowing them more freedom to do as they please. She had learned about things like this. What? Morrigan grunted, a bit slower on matters of politicking. She was a very straightforward girl, which made her sneakier moments more unexpected. Aurelia focused on the woman, tuning out her explanation of the situation to Morrigan, sister of the Queen, outspoken and scarred, and a knight interface behind and underneath her ponytail. She was clearly a more practiced warrior than her sister, judging from the calluses on her hands, and on a night world that was important. So she wasn't the Queen, despite likely being able to take the crown by force if required. That meant she was limited in some way. Politics alone, or something more? She focused on the conversation once more. Your brother is the 9th attempted conqueror in our history that used the title Emperor of Mankind. Granted, he claims that it's your father. Somewhat original of him. The woman spoke, nodding at Lord Brother in the center of the field, rolling his neck and shoulders. Brother will succeed. Cassandra spoke, still not breaking her staring with Urizen. He will defeat 44, and the last 6 will surrender without a fight. The woman raised her brows at that and snorted, unimpressed. I'm sure he will. He's beyond human for certain, but yesterday he grew weary after a dozen. This is more than threefold a dozen, many with superior weaponry. He wasn't physically weary. Morrigan refuted, turning her gaze back to their Lord Brother. Something like this isn't enough to exhaust him. Well, either he'll be defeated or our new overlord. Either way, it's nothing I can affect. Petra glanced over. You have a plug. You have a plug. The woman frowned and glared at nothing for a moment. My knight was destroyed against greenskins. Not much use on a proper battlefield anymore. Would you like to make a wager, then? Aurelia spoke innocently. The woman raised a brow at her, even as her eye narrowed. What are you proposing, girl? The outcome of the battle. If Cassandra's prediction comes true, you ask to join Lord Brother's retinue as a night pilot. I'm sure he'll appreciate having a veteran on hand. It was always good to recruit talent when possible, and Brother mentioned wanting to have a personal force of knights on hand for the conquest. And if it doesn't, then I'll ask on your behalf. Aurelia smiled widely at the woman, who snorted with a grin. Cheeky girl. Sure, I'll take you up on that offer. Better than staying here with the harlot on the throne. He'll have to get me a new knight, though. Otherwise he can fuck off. Aurelia kept her smile on her face, turning her gaze back to the field. She added the first tally to the marks against the woman. Petra and Morrigan glared openly. Cassandra ignored her entirely. Most of the field was the same type of knights. Thinking on the matter, she supposed lighter knights would be quicker to destroy in battle and thus less likely to survive, and anything larger would be harder to repair and thus less likely to endure. A comfortable middle ground, then, the knights most likely to survive without professional repairs being composed of the hunchbacked, shell-armored, melee and ranged weapon variants. Even if much of their weapons and armor had clearly been replaced with what the night world could scrounge up or forge locally. The herald declared the first 2 combatants to get onto their places on the field. Her brother already standing in his designated zone, and one of the rare variant knights stomping its way over to a space opposite of him. This one was taller, although its hunch still remained, carrying a great slab of shield armor on one arm and its other arm replaced by a massive metal lance. She made a note to learn the proper names for these machines. Representing her house in the Trial of Crowns, Baroness Damscorn takes to the field in her ancestral knight armor, Emerald Lancer. The herald called out from the near center of the field, one hand raising a flag that pointed at the knight armor in question. The knight armor raised its lance to the crowd, who roared in approval. Representing his house in the Trial of Crowns, Conqueror, aspirant Malum Kaido takes to the field with his personal arms and armor. The herald called out, waving a second flag at the giant that still stood about 10 meters shorter than the knight armor he stood on the opposite side of. The crowd roared again, clearly eager for some sort of bloodshed. Conqueror, aspirant, Petra asked with a furrowed brow. The red-haired woman replied, He's the 9th. We formalized the process on the 5th attempt. Hilarious. The herald will walk to the side of the field and blow the starting trumpet. When the trumpet blows, the warriors may begin their bout. The bout is to be until surrender or death. The herald carefully announced, quickly running off to the side of the arena in order to pick up the trumpet left there and blow into it. Immediately the knight armor began to move forwards, slowly at first with each many-ton stomp on comparatively soft earth, but quickly building up speed. Each stomp shook the ground lightly and caused a great indent on the earth, kicking up clumps of ground behind it as it ran forwards. Lance readied, it aimed it squarely at her brother. How much force was in that lance? 80 or so tons of war machine moving faster than a galloping horse, focused on the tip of that spear, enough to kill a castle wall, perhaps 2 or 3. Her brother stayed where he was, readying his shield and sword in a familiar stance. Aurelia smiled, recognizing what he was about to do, as did Petra and Morrigan. Does he intend to kill himself? Attempting to parry a charging Cerastus, the red-haired woman spoke, muttering to herself at the sight. Even a green-skinned warlord wouldn't be able if they bothered trying. Morrigan snorted in amusement. The women glanced over, but quickly turned back to the scene. Green Eye locked onto the scene. She wasn't present for his battles yesterday, it seemed, but then again neither was Aurelia. Lord Brother brought his sword down next to his waist and brought his shield up in front of him, arms flexed at ready. The Night Lancer continued its charge, getting closer and closer to him. It was about to connect. Lord Brother stomped to the side. The lance barely reached past him. His arm shot out. His shield crashed against the lance with a devastatingly loud clang of metal crashing into metal. It was like hearing thunder, even over the roaring engines of the knight armor. The charging lance shot sideways in an instant, tipped crashing into the ground. The knight armor's own legs crashed into it the next moment. Aurelia could also see the exact moment it realized, and the pilot started to panic. It was falling forwards. Its lance bent and snapped ruinously. Brother, shield out of his way, brought his sword out in an upward slash. A massive gout of golden fire followed as his blade crashed into the thinnest part of the great humanoid war machine's torso. Intense heat washed over them as a bonfire erupted in the sky for an instant. The light poured into her, and the sound of choir filled her mind. An instant later, the moment was past. The two halves of the night, separated by now molten sections of armor, continued onwards. The legs skid to a halt quickly, while the upper torso rolled twice before finally stopping, an immense line of torn earth following in its wake. Silence in the arena as Lord Brother lowered his burning sword by his side once more, striding over to the upper half of the armor. Reaching the roof of the knight, he jabbed his blade into the lid that normally protected the pilot, and twisted, popping the seal and causing it to swing open sideways. "I would recommend yielding, Lady Knight," she heard him say, politely as he ever was. She smiled as her body shuddered, the golden choir slowly leaving her mind again, disturbing poor Urizen. He looked up grumpily, breaking his staring contest with Cassandra, and voiced his displeasure. "Mrow." She scratched his ears to make up for the bother as the crowd started roaring in approval. The herald ran over to check on the situation, and Brother sheathed his blade with a smile. Then he started waving and smiling, which was met with even louder cheers of approval. He locked eyes with her and her sisters, and Aurelia waved with a grin. Petra, not to be outdone, waved harder, and with a large frown of determination. Morrigan gave a small wave, nervous as she was to show affection. Cassandra waved both hands with a blank face. Well, damn. I suppose I'm swearing oaths after this," the red-haired woman muttered. Aurelia smiled, and her eyes glowed a quiet gold. She poked at the dish before her, a plate-filled food of the local variety. Roasted meats with a glaze of honey, grilled and diced vegetables, mashed roots, a form of thick-cut pie, all steaming with warmth and smelling appetizing. Next to her tray, a cup of local wine, and then in front of her, a wide variety of dishes piled high on serving trays. The sound of excited rambling about her as the celebratory feast continued, hosted on behalf of her brother, succeeding at the formalized conquest trial. According to their traditions, he was now the king of Jidathra, and thus they could claim that they weren't bowing to any outsider. A somewhat useless-sounding workaround for them to cling to a handful of words, but it wasn't her business. Bemused by this, Brother accepted the title and decided to incorporate the iconography of the world into his planned empire. The end result of his design process was a chimeric griffin of sorts. A white lion, with the front half of an eagle, the cogwings of the Griffin Forge Empire, and a long, frilled, snake-like tail. In the iconography, it stood on a field of green and blue, with a crown of 3 stars over its head, and with its talon-like front limbs, it holds a golden sword and shield. This supposedly combined the crowned serpent of the ruling house of Jidathra, the mechanical eagle of the Griffin tech priests, and the 3 gods of the Eldar as a crown. The actual specifics of the imagery was beyond her interests, but it sounded important as Brother explained it to her. Aurelia certainly looked impressed by it, eyes glowing merrily as they were listening to him talk about it. Her attention returned to the food on her plate as she considered taking a bite. She was slightly hungry, but she could go on for much longer without needing to eat, and had done so before. She didn't know what most of these foods were before, and many more along the long feasting hall were still foreign to her. She was used to pale grain bread and corpse meals, to leaden waters and filthy beers. Brother warned them to not drink anything offered, at risk of being poisoned. It was much more difficult to poison food gathered from a large dish that many people would take from, much easier to poison the jugs that servants would refill specific drinks from, so the wine wasn't going to be touched, but she was hesitant to touch the food as well. She didn't see how clean the kitchens they were prepared in were. They could be filthy. Cassandra had already reached her third dish, eating at a formally appropriate but rapid pace. Petra was eating as mechanically as she ever did, uncaring of the stares around her. Aurelia was eating with perfect mannerisms, a beautiful smile on her pretty face, leaving ugly, once starving, scar-lipped Morrigan to stare at the plate of unfamiliar items with cutlery in hand and not move an inch to actually eat. The sheer waste was making her angry. This much food would be a bounty reserved for dreams on Barbarous. It would be eaten with tears of thanks in eyes. The world was rotting. She could see it. Her soul was filthy. She couldn't bring herself to touch any of it, not without knowing how clean the kitchens were, how clean the hands of the cooks were, and how thoroughly they kept filth from accumulating in their workstations. She had been learning to cook from her sisters and the eldar, mostly because it was difficult to stomach anything she didn't prepare herself. "Is there something wrong, guest?" A voice spoke near her, causing her to turn her head. The woman next to brought up a slice of meat to her lips and bit down, quickly chewing and swallowing with a raised brow. She was a young-looking woman, much shorter than Morrigan herself, and wearing a dress that actually seemed to fit her, instead of her body practically spilling out like Morrigan's own. The dresses from the Queen were gifts, but they were clearly gifts made for shorter women and quickly refitted for women of her and her sister's sizes. Petra was the shortest, and she was still 6.5 feet tall. The sky blue and cream-white dress looked best on her. Morrigan was the tallest at around 8 feet. She had to be careful to not snap the green-gold dress by moving the wrong ways, and it barely covered her. Her shoulders were mostly exposed. The skirt only came down to her mid-thigh, and her scarred and weathered body was clearly displayed. It was shameful, but it was a gift, and Brother needed this to go well, so she wore it without complaint. "I'm not hungry," she grumbled out, pushing her plate away and setting her cutlery down. The first thing she says to this stranger is a lie? How quick her tongue was to deceive others. She buried the shame under a layer of outwards irritation and hostility. "Oh, well, that's a shame. It's really quite good." The young lady with reddish-brown hair and emerald-green dress spoke, taking another bite and chewing it quickly. Morrigan had already ruined this conversation. Please stop talking and ignore her. Actually, please forget that she ever existed and go back to your meal in silence. Maybe next time the glazed saurus is delicious, especially paired with the wine and gravy. "Why are you still talking, strange woman?" Morrigan grunted, hoping to deter the stranger from speaking again. Much to her dismay, the stranger did not understand her silent plea for the conversation to stop, and kept going instead. "Ah, I'm Jeanniste de Valliere, daughter of Duchess Valliere. It's a pleasure to meet you." The so-called Janist quickly took another bite of food, making Morrigan suspect she would quickly die without eating. Morrigan cursed the fact that she had to be polite. Morrigan, chew, swallow. Just Morrigan, chew. Brother is the one with the fancy titles. I'm just his younger sister. Swallow. Oh. Well, he's a king now, at least, so that means you're a princess. So Morrigan, Princess of Jedathra. Does he have any other titles? Monk. Bite. Morrigan considered it for a moment. Janist took a quick sip of wine. Our father is the Emperor of mankind. He rules the Sol system. Ah! So Crown Princess Morrigan. I'm pleased to meet you. Morrigan turned her gaze to glance at the young woman, who was now loading up a second plate. She seemed to completely roll over any fumbling Morrigan made earlier, cheerfully speaking in between rapid mouthfuls. She seemed completely oblivious to her grunts and aura of irritation. This conversation might be salvageable. So what's with the hole? Janus reached up to Mime, tugging at her ears. People with the long ears? They're eldar, Morrigan grunted. They're not actually humans. They just look like it. They're allies with my brother due to an oath made back on their homeworld of Charnak. And so the conversation went, Morrigan trying to not fumble her words or tear her dress, and Janus seemingly missing every impolite thing she did as she worked her way through a second and then a third plate of food. It was relatively rare to find someone taller than her anymore. Only her brother and old Wraith Knight Malwen, and one of those was a dead eldar entombed in a giant bone construct. Everyone else barely reached her sternum, with the rare exception of a few of the eldar, who were still almost a full head shorter than her and their highest. Her father's emissary was a new one, added to that very short list, being 9 feet tall and clad in great slabs of golden-plated power armor, looking enormous compared to everyone except her brother. Shield, Captain Kaitan. He introduced himself as, and he was here on behalf of their father, coming to check up on them and act as their father's voice among brothers' circle of various males with important-sounding titles and duties. Honestly, it was entirely too much gold. Gold, with white-grey helm visor and trim, and red cloaks and horsetail, and just a hint of blue in the gemstones inlaid in the armor. His weapon, an ostentatious combination of a glaive and gun, was also decorated with golden eagles and sunbursts. Even the eldar, normally perfectly composed in behavior, occasionally gave double takes at all the wealth on display in the giant man's armor and weaponry. The slightly stuffy stance and manner of speaking hadn't helped much for the first impressions. She hadn't been sure what she was expecting when it came to an emissary from her apparent real father, one who called himself Emperor of Mankind's of all things. She definitely hadn't expected someone who would exchange tips on how to hand-wash laundry with the maids, or someone who apparently already knew how to speak Eldar somehow, because the silks I wear come from Terran weaver clans who use a genivariant of a local arachnid. You can't use rougher cleaners for it, rather you have to go slowly with more gentle cleaners. For more delicate pieces, you can only use warm water. It makes it a rather long process, but I find it meditative, the brown-haired maid said, chiming in with a smile. Kaitan agreed with a nod. His expression wasn't visible behind the helm, but she imagined it was also smiling. Yes, meditative is a good way of putting it. I find it helps me to relax. I prefer working over lazing about regardless. The armor is much easier to find appropriate cleaners for, but the grooves and nooks tend to take more time regardless. The true issue is that you need a 3-step process: wash, rinse, oil, correct? The red-haired maid piped up. Wraithbone doesn't require this, but most common armor among our people is made of steel and leather. Do you? Morrigan turned to exchange looks with her sisters, all 3 of which were simply observing the scene unfurling before them with various emotions. Petra seemed annoyed. Cassandra was expressionless. Aurelia was amused. She wasn't sure what her own expression was. She hadn't been expecting this based on Petra's offhanded statement about how well-maintained his armor seemed to be. Her father's emissary, surrounded by a gaggle of maids, chatting about house-care techniques. She waved a hand to get the attention of her sisters, then pointed a thumb at the exit. They nodded, and slowly the 4 of them crept out of the room and into the hallways. Once out, and the door closed, Morrigan turned to them and spoke flatly. "I'm going to go bathe and change clothes." Petra nodded in acceptance. Aurelia smiled and replied, "I think I shall wait until Shield, Captain Kaitan, is finished. I wish to ask about Terra." Cassandra waited for Aurelia to finish before turning to look at her. "I'm coming." She could use someone to help get between her shoulder blades, she supposed. That was the hardest part to scrub. It never felt like she properly got to it. She could use a stick with a brush on it, something of that nature. The sisters went their separate ways, Petra walking off in some direction, Aurelia staying where she was, humming a tune, Morrigan and Cassandra walking back to their rooms to pick up a set of spare clothes first. Opening the door, she saw Muriel currently in the process of changing their sheets, ears and then eyes flickering over to them as they entered the doorway. Morrigan felt like she was guilty of something just looking into those stern eyes, even if she knew she had done nothing wrong. This time, at least. "Young ladies," the headmaid greeted, bowing properly and making Morrigan slightly uncomfortable. "Is your business with your father's emissary concluded?" He got distracted with the maids. Cassandra answered tonelessly. Silence for a moment. In Pour there was Barkay. Muriel's ears flickered once, and her eyes narrowed. "Oh, they were sharing tips on cleaning armor and washing silks when we left," Morrigan clarified. Silence for another moment. "And—" Muriel's ears angled upwards as her brows rose slightly. "Oh, we came to get clothes for a bath," Morrigan continued, foot shifting slightly for some reason. The dress was entirely too tight. Muriel nodded and was about to speak before Cassandra interrupted with a blunt request. "Join us." Morrigan froze. Muriel's eyes flashed with a few emotions. "It would hardly be proper for a maid to, please," Cassandra added, again completely tonelessly. Muriel's ears swayed slightly as her mouth closed. Her lips pressed together as she considered the idea, eyes flicking over to Morrigan. "Only if your sister is comfortable with it." Cassandra turned a blank stare on her. Morrigan looked away. "Yes, it's all right with me." Muriel was quiet for a long time before finally replying. "Very well. If the young ladies wish, I shall aid them in washing. Please allow me to finish this task first. We'll help," Cassandra offered on her behalf. Morrigan almost wanted to complain, but then Cassandra turned a blank stare on her again. She relented. The sheets were very quickly made, and the three departed for the very hot water and scented soaps of the bath. Muriel helped her wash that middle part of her back, humming a gentle song as she did. Cassandra spent most of the time completely submerged in the hot water. It was nice. She felt clean afterwards. The people of Barbarous were being settled on Jadathra. Most of the 24,000 were being given the traditionally fallow regions in the northern continent in order to settle, farm, and expand into usable land. That region was underpopulated due to its relatively frigid temperatures for half the year, stony soil, and lack of effective seaports. To the people of Barbarous, it was comfortably warm, with relatively dry and fertile soil, and a lack of natural dangers. It was practically paradise compared to Barbarous, with massive forests filled with healthy flora and fauna, long periods of sunlight and warmth, and only a handful of toxic berries to worry about not eating. They were given surplus supplies, were able to take all their tools off the ship, and a pristine Wraithbone fortress was erected there for them to start their initial townships from. They began work almost immediately, mayors studying the calendars they had been provided with, almost religious devotion, and immediately planning their harvest in accordance with the dates provided. They looked completely different to how they did on Barbarous. Moods were high and songs were being sung. They had filled out from the healthy meals and clean water provided, and almost all of them performed the instructions on how to keep clean and healthy with fervent devotion. It was better than she could have hoped for them when she first fled from Neker's lair so long ago. It felt bittersweet that she was responsible for essentially nothing of it, and that she was going to leave them behind soon. She could always visit in the future, but would she even have the right to? It was her fault that more of them weren't here, that the evacuation was partially sabotaged. She had been nothing but a burden to these people, from her days leading pale dead to slaughter them to even now. She hadn't managed to help them at all. How worthless. Her only benefit to these people is that she had a brother who was able to actually help them. "Lady Morrigan," a familiar voice called out to her. She turned her head to look down at the man who had approached her, filled out with more meat and less weathering on his face, and a brighter look in his eyes. It was Thomas, wearing the ad hoc ceremonial garb of a new barber and baron, that being a single green sash. "Thomas," she replied, nodding at the man. She had brought refugees to his village all those years ago, and he had taken them in and helped her defend against that great horde. The horde that her brother descended upon and slaughtered most of by himself. He gave a weathered smile, twisted by immense optimism at his current situation, contrasted with something sad. "I don't imagine we'll see each other much anymore. You'll be off with your God-blessed brother in the stars, and we'll be settling down here." "Seems like it," she grunted out, turning her gaze to the white fortress surrounded by lush wildflowers and swaying grasses that slowly turned into immense forests. Not a drop of rot or murk anywhere to be seen. This was apparently the late winter, and it was still as warm as a Barbaran summer. Representing all the people of Barbarous here, we'd like to ask you something." Thomas shuffled slightly, reached behind him and pulling out a roll of cloth. She turned her head towards it. "It's something of a tradition to make these sorts of symbols, especially so on these here night worlds apparently, so we only thought it appropriate for—" He unfurled the roll of cloth, revealing what was depicted on the banner. A woman with white hair and a crown of flowers, holding a scythe in a field of pale corn. She is smiling. Morrigan looked at it for a moment, stunned. Thomas spoke sheepishly. "We'd thought it might be a bit presumptuous of us, but we'd like to use your image for our symbol." "Why?" she managed to get out. Thomas scratched his head and shuffled his feet. "Ah, well, it's just one of those pay your respects sort of thing. We'll choose a different one if you want." "No, why?" she swallowed. "I didn't do anything." She felt her face twist into something ugly. Thomas gave her a long look before shaking his head with a sigh and a smile. "Your brother may have brought us here, and we appreciate it, and all he's done for us, we truly do. But we didn't forget how you were there first, with nothing but a beat-up scythe, some ragged clothes, and a mean look in your eye. You were willing to fight for us when you had just as little. We don't want to forget something like that." She stared for another long moment, speechless. She quickly looked away, pulling up her scarf to cover the bottom of her face. "Do what you like," she said, voice thick with emotion. Thomas sounded like he was smiling. "We can certainly oblige, Lady Morrigan." The Astronomicon had been lit, and energies enough to fuel it for 10 years had been poured into its sorcerous reservoir. Malcador and his new students were incapable of fueling it entirely on their lonesome, but their efforts were enough to keep it lit until he returned. It was unfortunate, but the warp arts were unpredictable at the best of times, tutoring psychers enough to utilize their abilities while guiding them away from unwelcome mindsets was always slow going. If left to their own devices, they'd inevitably find some voice in the warp and decide it was worthy of worship. Mortals were prone to such fearful reactions when all they knew was the closed walls of their old lives. A scholar of the old Earth made a comparison like that once, perhaps. It was difficult to recall such ancient days. Caves and shadows on the wall, or something along those lines. Filled with the instability of song and story, travel through the warp was unpredictable at the best of times. Endless narratives attempting to twist the things that enter to their own ends. Things of the material world were not used to such story-weaving, and were usually twisted into unrecognizable and wretched things by the clashing narratives filling their forms and steering their minds away from themselves. Many did not have the strength of will to keep true to themselves when surrounded by so many voices demanding that they change, that they be something else, something that suited them more than the individual. The weakness of those to whom struggle and independence was foreign, a weakness that he had long since realized was inherent to humanity. Men will naturally seek to protect their children. Men are fallible and will inevitably protect them too much or too little. The wills of their children will be less and less tempered unless they are forced to struggle once more. Untempered children will fall under the sway of unrighteous actors, and those actors will bring suffering to their domains and all domains around them. These actors will inevitably be overthrown by men with wills tempered by the suffering they brought. And men with wills tempered will begin this process anew. This was a truth he realized in time. He did not know it in his youth, in his days of reckless questing, merry feasting, and the company of eager women. In those days he blamed circumstance of birth, for men having the misfortune to be born behind strong walls. In those days all he knew was that his sword was straight, and he had a clear path to his enemies. He knew better now, for he had seen this great cycle play out time and time again. Normally he would be content to wait, for men with wills tempered would rise up and bring order to this broken galaxy themselves. Now, however, the possibility of mankind's utter defeat was too great to ignore. Extinction or eternal enslavement, neither of which were acceptable outcomes for his people, he would not allow it. And so, once more, he bore the gold crown of Aquila upon a troubled brow. And so his will burned in the warp, and the manifold narratives that attempted to lead them astray were instead forced to bow to his story. A great burning flame surrounding his fleet, turning the chaos of random wills into a single vision of imperial gold. Long ago, when he first bore a crown, he had lamented having no clear path and a useless sword. He knew better now. Now he knew that attempting to find a path was useless with the constant whispers of malicious things surrounding mankind, constantly attempting to lead the steadfast astray, to worship wretched things that did nothing but take. Now he knew it was better to slice through the endless tangles with his sword and force a path through by tempered will. There were no steps to take. He did not need to search for a path or a trick. It was the simplest thing, not even a struggle, once he realized its riddle. All he had to do was cut. Oh, how he had laughed when he first realized. A great fool, a madman, roaring with boisterous humor, with hands on his head and belly. For using a sword was something he was quite familiar with. In the warp, surrounding a crusade fleet of thousands of ships, the massive image of a cross-hilted blade sliced through the twisting paths of the warp, stretching for thousands of kilometers in all directions, a blade too large to be wielded by the mightiest of world giants, a blade made of flame and will. The will of the man sitting in a golden throne of the massive ship that served as the jeweled decoration where the blade and hilt met. His breathing was steady as he channeled his will through the massive psychic amplifiers, artifacts of the age of technology, preserved and repaired with what he still remembered of their design process. It was never truly his interest to study such devices, something that proved to be a mistake. The construction of the Astronomicon was still possible, albeit requiring the aid of the machine ministers, but it was not as effective as he knew it could be. The model he had fitted into the ship was similarly massive, taking up the majority of what internal workings he could spare. He would renovate it once he had the time to rediscover the specific technologies and work on it. "Lord Emperor, we will be arriving at Chthoniya within a day." A quietly awed voice came from the redundant navigator upon the smaller throne in front of and below his own. Three-eyed and web-handed, there was no purpose to being irritated at it. Concessions had to be made to ensure his fleets had the ability to travel the warp, and he could not be everywhere at once. Training psychers for the task would be ideal, but the Great Crusade could not afford the delay such a task would require. And so the mutants that self-styled themselves the Navis Nobilite were given honorable duties and imperial guarantees, despite their numerous flaws and undesirable habits. Required to inbreed to maintain their useful mutations, and prone to politicking behind closed doors and nefarious smiles. Seemingly incapable of honesty and with hands too pallid to consider holding a sword, not one was a warrior, and each led a sheltered existence in luxurious manners. He could not afford a war with them yet, no matter how much disdain he had for them, not when mankind needed his aid. So he stayed his blade and made note to put them to the sword when humanity was once more the masters of their fates. When they no longer needed his aid, he knew the day would come again. All mankind needed was a strong hand to pull them from their current muck and another to show them the way. So he tolerated an conniving, frail, mutated spawn of incest on board his ship. Bucephalus was its name, named for a warhorse of his ancient youth, back in days now lost to the mists of history. He had long forgotten the campaigns of those days save their broadest strokes, but he remembered Bucephalus, a mighty and foul-tempered beast that thrashed its head like a bull when brought to fury. A more loyal companion he could not ask for. "You have my thanks, Lady Navigator," he rumbled out, voice deep and full with power, eyes focused squarely on the distant image of the planet in question and cutting a path to it, seeing farther than she and knowing their time of arrival long before. He did not bother to know her name and did his best to ignore the rapturous expression on her waifish face. Guiding a fleet through the warp was simply a matter of will and experience. Just because he had time to learn did not mean she should fall to her knees. Were he a younger man, he might command her to fall to her knees in a different manner. He had few standards in those days, and she was still a woman. He banished the thought from his mind and focused once more on his target. He had much too little time to waste it indulging in carnal acts. Chthoniya, once a mining colony in the earliest days of void sailing. Any mineral wealth upon it was long since exhausted, tunnels digging deep enough into the molten core that their deepest tunnels ignited the very air with a bodiless flame. The surface was ruled by a distant offshoot colony of the Mechanicum, but the only resource they extracted from Chthoniya was humans. All else came from the still rich veins of metal in the asteroid fields throughout the system. They were not the majority of the population. The majority of the population lived below the surface. a redundant and abandoned world, the people unfortunate enough to be born underneath its surface, feuding over ancient and crumbling facilities that produced what scant materials they could in the shadowed halls of endless tunnels. Volcanic, rocky, and long exhausted, he had only one reason to travel to this place. By word of his supposed son, one of his daughters had landed here, currently scraping out a meager existence as the leader of one of the many gangs that warred in the tunnels below. Assuming the message was not full of lies, that was a state he would expect to find 16 in, drawn from his memories as a fighting man when the people would beat the kettle drums at his march and scatter gold dust at the hooves of his warhorse. 16 was to be such a warrior, with the charisma of a bold warrior and the easy smiles of an upright commander. Dauntless before their soldiers and mind-churning with stratagems to lead them to victory. 16 was to be better than him in those days, always holding a humble awareness of themselves and the world that he lacked back then. 16 was drawn to lead others by instinct. They all were, but she was designed to win over their hearts as well as their minds. It was only natural that she would be leading a band of like-minded individuals, long used to honest struggle and the clashing of blades. She was the closest of the listed locations, and thus the simplest manner to start confirming the contents of the message. Other, smaller pieces of information had already been tested and confirmed, but giving concessions to disguise from a greater deception was a venerable trick to the snakes that wear human skin. And if it was indeed the deception of a serpent, he would go to his proclaimed territory and cut out that tongue himself, assuming his tiger warrior and the remaining thunder warriors hadn't already done so. He was glad he eventually decided to go against Malcador's suggestions on that, levying what few survivors of his old legions there were and granting them a final duty. His old friend was entirely too grim and suspicious at times. It reminded him of himself many thousands of years ago. He failed to give them an honorable death at Ararat. With this, he would give them another chance to die with swords in hand and purpose in their hearts, or a renewed life of yet more questing for mankind's future. What man should be denied the right to fight for his people? Who had the right to deny that right? None did. Certainly not an old relic from long-misted and half-remembered histories, such as himself. The thousands of ships exited the warp, returning once more to more stable reality, and now stationed outside of the system in question. At once, the distant void navies of the lost Mechanicum colony began to respond, moving to defensive positions around critical assets. The Archmagus on board his ship was already broadcasting the appropriate signals and information to the local tech priests through their psychic machine revenant, a servitor they called it, but necromancy was something he was quite familiar with. Through the machine interface they turned what might have once been a man, or what at one point had the potential to be a man, into a puppet. Long ago it was the domain of sorcerers alone. The technical accomplishment was impressive, even if the result was crude and unseemly to look upon. He wished they would have the proprietary to at least cover the thing in concealing garments, not leave them mostly nude and exposed as they usually were. But no, that would not please the machine god if they concealed the conjoining of flesh and technology. He was quite confident that Herr Descher did not dream of that manner of conjoinment. He grunted, accidentally causing a wave of panicked tensing and worried glances among his attendees. They paid his every action entirely too much consideration, which was frustrating in its own right, falling over themselves to correct some perceived failing when his thoughts were entirely elsewhere. Just as was predicted, the Archmagos, distantly relaying communications, punched in keys and chanted in his machine, "Speak," even faster in the attempt to please him. He did nothing in response. Anything he did would only exacerbate the issue and make them even more nerve-wracked, a state that wasn't conducive to getting tasks completed quickly and effectively. Shortly enough, the Archmagus turned and bowed. "Lord Omnissiah, they have accepted our codes. We shall not be hindered by them." The nervous twitching all throughout his form and panic thoughts in his nibbled soul conveyed an immense amount of needless worry. It was best to assuage him now. "You have my thanks, Lord Archmagos. You have performed well." He nodded to emphasize this point. The almost immediate relaxing and reverent gaze told him that it had been successful. Shifting the placement of his immense gauntlets, the Emperor stood from his throne. a giant of 4 meters, clad in immense plates of Icarus golden metal and the gentle hum of powered servos, left gauntlet ending in an a-taloned hand, heart and left underarm covered behind an red and gold ecranche, symbols of eagles and grim faces over the whole of his armor, and golden laurel atop his head. It was quite ostentatious, but he was fond of the hue. Casting his psychic sight over the whole of Cathania, he searched for a particular soul. It did not take long to find, bright as it was compared to the dim souls around it. Each soul of a normal man, a candle, gathered together to shine like stars in the warp. The souls of his children, radiant bonfires that gathered into shapes more complex than mere fire. He would know, as those soul shapes were his handiwork. There, in the midst of the crust near the equator, the fledgling soul of his daughter rested. Sun-crowned, sky-skinned, cattle-horned, music-bringing, queen of hearts and warriors. He smiled. He smiled. A wave of awed faces followed in its wake. He was in too good a mood to be irritated at this. Deputy Commander Heron, you have my license. Carry out the established plans for contact with the local mechanicum. He commanded the man who stood next to his throne. The man snapped into a bow and responded immediately. At once, Lord Emperor. He could tell that the man was curious about what he was going to do in the meantime, but too professional to state the question aloud. I will be on the planet. I have a daughter to retrieve. Archmagos, inform them of my use of the Imperial teleportation array. With that, he focused his will. Some kilometers away on his ship, the teleportation array churned to life at his bidding, and the desired coordinates were fed within its matrices. With a furrowed brow, he commanded the machine, and the machine obeyed. The Emperor of Mankind disappeared from the ship with the sound of thunder carried by archaeotech lightning and appearing again within the atmosphere of Thonia, miles above, to ensure that he did not strain the machine by trying to teleport him into some physical object. Rapidly, gravity began to pull down on him, which he allowed. Wind whipped past his face as he fell. The air screamed as he descended. Then, roughly a minute later, he focused his will again. His descent slowed at a comfortable rate until he came to a gentle stop, armored boots touching down in the midst of a long destroyed ruin, the only notable feature of which was the tunnel which led down into the labyrinthine network below his feet. Ignoring the baffled stares of the humans hiding in shadows all round him, he began to walk. Step after step into the dim shadows below the surface, guided by the glow of his psychic power. He did not need to carry a weapon here. Those that were foolish enough to attack him, he cut down with thought alone. He had no need for his full complement of war gear against the mortals of this world. Perhaps an hour into his delving into the planet's interior, he rounded a particular corner. A defensible killing field opened up in front of him, carved into the rock by people now long dead, manned by newcomers guided by the intuition of their warlord, or perhaps the will of a foster. He stood there in the midst of the underground killing field and waited. After some time, a voice called out in a language he did not speak, a bastardization of several languages he did speak, however. "You're a great big fracker, ain't ya? The frack you won." The voice of a hungry lean ganger from behind an improvised barricade. Hundreds of guns pointed to his direction from equally many openings in the walls. Each a veteran of a life of gang warfare and toil under the shadows of endless rock ceilings. The Emperor of Mankind smiled. "I'm a father looking for his daughter. I believe you know of her. Frack off. We don't know a godshit thing. Go on and git before we frack some fracking holes in your shiny ass." A loyal lookout and watchman was hard to come by on planets such as these, he applauded them. Thankfully, he knew how to negotiate with warbands such as these. "You're lying." A simple statement. Primitive guns immediately fired upon his location from all angles, even a few above him. A combination of will, the field projector, and his armor protected him from anything men such as these could muster. He let them fire until they ran out of ammunition. The clouds of weapon smoke and stone dust were cleared away by an application of his will. Fear exploded in the minds of all the warriors around him as they saw he was untouched. "I'm a father looking for his daughter. May I speak to her? Why, gimme just a moment, friend. Competent too. Truly a gem." After some time, two figures emerged from a barricade, great metal sheets moved by two large abhumans and allowing two others to move through. A man and a woman of great scale, perhaps 3 meters already, a particularly harsh world, or an early landing. Her proportions told him it was likely the latter. The man looked upon him, swallowing down fear as best as he could, masking it behind stoic will, and spoke. "Ye speaker to Kageddon, overlord of this war tribe, ye claim to be the father of no name?" His daughter stared at him, suspicious, but the gleam of wonder in her eyes. He turned his gaze to the petty ganger, the one who cared for his daughter then. "I am the emperor of mankind. I have come to retrieve my daughter. I presume you are her foster?" His voice rumbled, shaking the wills of the empty-gunned gangers, an increasingly nervous-looking man. "He is," she spoke, voice powerful and will strong as she looked at him, having to crane her head slightly to meet his gaze. Her hand was near her gun and war mace. She was ready to battle him if he attempted to attack her or any of her found warband, uncaring of his position and power. He smiled. Her eyes widened. "Then I owe him coin for keeping my daughter safe. Come if you would, I'm here to bring you home. Ain't leaving them in the dumps." She refused, much as he was expecting. Strong bonds between them already, as was her nature. He raised his brows. She wavered. "Go on and get, no name," Kageddon demanded with a headshake to her slightly stunned look, much as he was expecting. "You're already banging your head on tar rocks down here. We all knew you'd outgrow here eventual like." She stared for a long while, turning her gaze across the assembled gangers. They came around her, smiles of farewell on their faces. For even as she had the strength to resist his command and demonstrated might, they did not. She frowned deeply, brows furrowed in sadness, scanning about for any reason to stay. She found none, eventually turning back to him, patiently standing where he was. "You're gonna pay them." "As promised," she demanded, face scrunched up in an angry sorrow. He nodded. As promised. He reached out a hand, which she hesitantly took. Leading her by the hand from that place, he allowed her to look back and wave goodbye. In the typical ganger fashion, this was a mutual exchange of insults and threats. "You get the frack out of here, you great big bitch. Sook, my ass, grey on." "Yeah, just pissed. I'm moving up." Eventually, she turned back to him, nervously glancing at him again and again as they walked through the tunnels leading back up to the surface. "So, did ye give me a name?" she hesitantly asked. He smiled and squeezed her hand. She swallowed and squeezed back. "I named you Hathor." There was silence for a long time. "Weird name," he snorted in amusement. They had sheltered his daughter for 6 years, and even in such a world as that, she was a year or two far from full development. With the measures woven into her flesh, that was an impressive deed and required being rewarded. For this, they were given 6,000 Mars-pattern lasguns with instructions on their use and repair. A rudimentary weapon of robust design, outclassed in strength by nearly anything else of similar industrial needs, but requiring very little in terms of maintenance and ammo facilities. It would grant them significant power to protect themselves and expand, and in time they could likely come to dominate their fellow gangs in that subterranean realm. It was a pittance compared to what they did on his behalf, protecting his daughter. It was exactly what such men and women would appreciate above all else. For coin was worthless when enemies were at the gates, but strength was a universal currency. With weapons they could trust, they had the chance to secure their future with their own strength, owing nothing to a greater power. Bargained and done, and now their path was their own to shape. What warrior did not dream of that? With that business concluded, a detachment of the greater fleet had been left with Thethonia to facilitate the integration of the world, its mechanicum, and its people into the wider Imperium. Loyal aides would be responsible for the tedium of that process, essential as it was, and they would shortly begin their own subfleets to bring more worlds of humanity into the wider Imperium. A fractal cascade of ever-expanding ships and soldiers, quantity being a quality all to itself. He could not afford to personally manage all affairs of the Imperium, but that was acceptable. All he had to do was be great enough to unify humanity under a shared vision and trust that the peoples who had endured the age of strife would be capable of acting competently. He and his personal forces would attend to the most pressing issues, while the daily affairs of the state would be left in the hands of local populations. The local rulers had guided their people through the long night. They would be more than capable of contributing their share once backed by the industry and support of 1,000 of their peer leaders. Similarly, those who had no desire to return to the conditions of the long night would naturally slay the malicious actors who only sought to sate their bottomless appetites. In giving men a vision of a better tomorrow and a single hand of aid, they would crawl through 1,000 battles to make that vision a reality. He just needed to ensure the greatest horrors of the galaxy could not consume humanity before they were strong enough to stand once more. Strong enough to stand against wretched sorcerers, frothing mutants, conquering aliens, and gibbering horrors. Even in his most distant youth, he recalled warring with those things, evils always present and tormenting mankind. It took thousands of years to slay the last of their ilk on old Terra the first time, and hundreds of years to do so the second time. He wondered how long it would be before he had to do it again. He did not know how long it would take to do this task for every world of mankind. To put the sorcerers to the sword, to put down the mutants, to throw back the alien, to banish the horrors. Tens of thousands of years? Ever. Then again, not every example of each required culling. There were sorcerers of strong will who refused the whispers of the warp. There were mutants with mastery over themselves and their forms. There were aliens who were not a threat to mankind, nor intending to become one. These could be safely permitted to live and act by their own merits. There were no horrors that did not deserve annihilation. He himself had certainly failed to ever encounter one. Twisting parasites, devouring the souls of men and making slaves of their corpses. He made it his business to put these to the sword and shatter their song with his will. His supposed son had already allied with one such faction of alien, the exodite eldar. His brow furrowed as he considered what he knew of them. He ignored the ripples of unease that washed over the assembled peoples in the Chamber of Light with him. Eldar were a fey-like people, capricious and cruel, who made it their business to abduct weaker peoples, bringing their tithes of flesh back to decadent cities, made of bone and torturing their very souls with all manner of psychic rituals mastered over 1,000 lifetimes. They used advanced technosorcery for a wide variety of purposes and had access to another realm of their own design. Sometimes they lived upon verdant worlds, and any who entered those places were quickly killed and their entrails hung upon branches. Isolationist, arrogant, violent. He did not see any reason to tolerate them with the information he had. His supposed son must have more knowledge in this regard than he, or perhaps a particularly poor sense of judgment. Not impossible, but unlikely with what he had designed 13 with. Or perhaps it isn't a 13 of a set of 20. Perhaps it is a 13th iteration of 0. The name certainly suggested such, and allies against the great enemy would be prioritized over all things else. Speculation was of little use at this time. His fleets had already been commanded to not attack such vessels and peoples until attacked first. He would doubtlessly meet them in time and would take their measure then. Until then, it would not do to needlessly sabotage one who reached their hand out in friendship. One of 20 thus far, too soon to declare him a son or deceiver yet. He found himself hoping it was the former. It had been many years since 0 was crafted, and the boy needed a true brother-in-arms. It would be good for him. Lord Emperor. The navigator began again, and already he knew what she was going to say. He resisted the urge to grunt, knowing that would only lead her to needless despair. "We'll be arriving at Inwit within a day," she finished, marveling at his great golden sword. He partook in a small smile at the crass jest and replied in his usual fashion. Wide eyes and agape mouth was his thanks for having the audacity to make an expression. "You have my thanks, Lady Navigator," he rumbled out, wishing that he could stand from this amplifying device. His daughter's tutelage had to be left to his custodians for now, for to ensure the quickest possible path through the warp, his dedicated will was required. Perhaps he could incorporate a secondary array into his armor. It would be unlikely to be as efficient, but it would allow him to move from this chair. He could hardly tutor his daughters while stuck on a throne. He would check on Hathor again once they entered the system. or perhaps it was more pertinent to retrieve 7 first. He considered the 2 paths before him and decided to cut. He would speak to her both before and after retrieving 7. "How goes your studies, Hathor?" he rumbled out, announcing his presence within the great study on board the ship, placed here specifically to facilitate the education of his daughters. The doorways were large enough to fit his frame, enormous compared to a mortal man, and much of their design was the result of the manifold architects among the Terran shipyards attempting to win his favor with their best works. The large chamber held a single primary lectern at the center, surrounded by the stair steps of a great colosseum with integrated desks. This design was common, simple to produce, and effective enough, although he did not remember where he first learned of it. In the center, a large, hollow projector was mounted to aid the tutors in administering the lessons of pen and state. Within this chamber, a small group of his gold-clad custodians paused in their lesson-giving, turning to give proper warriors' salutes to their king and crafter. 19 of the men in total organized as a single small shield host to guard and educate his daughters, of which the majority were simply on the sides and outside of the chamber to ensure no ambush by unscrupulous entities was successful. Handpicked specifically for this task, not for particular martial merit, for if he were to select by martial ability alone, he would have called upon Valdor, stoic, observant, yet unmatched among the hosts of mankind and utterly unsuited to educate his daughters. The Captain General, prototype for the Custodes as a whole, was subject to a slightly earlier iteration of the genocrafting process. He was powerful, he was intelligent, he was loyal without question, and he could feel nothing but a sense of duty. Valdor was a sword of his will, a man with a blade-shaped soul. He needed more from his daughters than the ability to act as useful tools. He needed warriors and generals, he needed queens and heroes, he needed allies he could rely on without question. Valdor's soul was a sword making its best attempt to appear human. A precious thing, a trustworthy thing, but not a tutor. Later, custodian candidates were selected more carefully. Such batches were derived from a larger percentage of those without weapon souls. Currently, the only student in the chamber was his daughter, barely taller than the custodians educating her, and a table section filled with haphazard writing utensils sprawled before her. She perked up at his arrival, eyes brightening with a happy glow as she pushed herself away from the papers and quills. She moved to stand, before stopping suddenly, turning her eyes back towards the silent, feathery-souled custodian standing at the lectern. A silent plea for permission to stand, which was granted with a tilt of his helm. Quickly she rose and bound her way over to him. She cut herself off, frowning and focusing before attempting to speak again. "It has been going well, father," she enunciated in near-flawless old Terran. She's been learning for several weeks now, so her progress was exactly on the expected pace. It's likely she'll fall back to her native Ganger tongue in times of duress regardless. He smiled, she grinned. So I have been told. More? We have arrived in the Inuit system and are now approaching the planet in question, allowing me to finally rise from the throne again. I decided to speak with you before retrieving your sister. I'm happy to hear that, Father. Custodian Strigoi tells me that I have completed my basic education and am ready to move on to higher fields soon. I was waiting for the opportunity to tell you. She spoke formally, careful with her words and demeanor, clearly attempting to please him. You are more than welcome to visit me upon the throne, Hathor. I would welcome the company of my daughter, he spoke, causing her smile to waver slightly. After a moment she replied, I am uncomfortable with the behavior of your attendees, Father. She glanced away as she said this. He grunted and nodded in reply, knowing full well how irksome the reverent gazes became at times. She would have to become used to such in time. She was a child still. She had time to grow. He decided to alter the course. And how goes your studies in the war arts? He asked with a small smile, knowing what was to come. His daughter gave a toothy grin and immediately fell into an excited ramble about her spars and games of tactics, just as thrilled by a worthy challenge as he was. He indulged himself in the simple joy of listening to his daughter's exuberance. Inuit was still perhaps an hour away. He had some time to spare. Inuit was a world that slowly circled a dim, dying star. At any point, half of its surface was covered in vast expanses of ice and cold, untouched by the heat of proper light, and the other half was blazing and equally unforgiving desert, with only a thin sliver of survivable temperatures along the twilight of its surface. Most of its population lived in great cities constructed under the earth, and what few humans survived on the surface dwelled in that thin strip of dawn and dusk. Nomadic clans that wandered between underground cities, long tempered by the harsh and unforgiving climate into a robust and steadfast peoples. Most impressive was that, even in conditions such as these, the people of Inuit managed to develop a modest empire of their own, spanning several systems with small fleets. A feat they managed in the midst of the long night, when 9/10 of all things were brought to ruination. In such a time, they had managed to grow, overcoming the hardships of their world to thrive as a people. This was worthy of praise. He strode through the relentless blizzard, forcing its winds and hails to slow and turn into gentle snowfall with his will. The cold was bracing, invigorating, nostalgic, and he drank deep breaths from it. It reminded him of his most ancient youth, growing upon the chilling steppes of his homeland. In the underground fortress before him, he could feel the soul of his daughter, Seven. Immense and frozen, an unstoppable movement, endless evaporation but never diminishment, a white bulwark. Drawn from his days as a slave, tormented by the whips and cruel hooks of his captors, forced to sweat and toil at their grinding wheels, but never breaking, never failing, and overcoming them in the end. In those days his flesh was hard and cold, for they offered him but a loincloth to garb himself, and a great fire in his belly warmed him. All he knew was the task before him, and what must be done to complete it. Seven was to be better than him. She would not be forced to grind wheels of pain. She would see the challenge as what it was, and her mind would churn with methods to overcome it. She would see a task others decry as impossible, and throw herself against it with a joyous fire in her heart. She would have the strength to bear the great stone wheel, and the indefatigable will to utterly master it. The task alone would be enough to fill her heart. His steps cracked the ice as he approached, and the heat of his will turned it into streams of spring waters. Reaching the immense doors of the bunker, he raised a great hand and knocked. Boom, boom, boom. He waited patiently, breathing in the delightfully chill air. The picked recorder, outside of the bunker, came to life, looking down upon him. Noise issued forth from inside, and another technology, a speaker of sorts, came to life with the quiet hum of lightning fueling it. "Stranger, what business do you have with the clan of Dawn?" They spoke in an accented language similar to Gaelish, much to his amusement. He was fluent. In several variations of that tongue, this was simply one of the most recent iterations. "I am a father seeking his daughter. I asked for guest rights among your clan," he rumbled out, knowing that the honor of people who dwell in harsh lands would ensure they agree. Sure enough, the bunker whirred to life, and the immense iron gates cracked open just enough for him to squeeze through, quickly shut behind him by a host of men clad in thick furs, pulling upon 1,000 chains through a pulley system of sorts. Likely the engines of such broke long ago, or perhaps they were not used to spare precious reserves of power. He turned his head through the crowds of men with somewhat more advanced weaponry than most, fingers far from triggers and tips pointed down. They were suspicious, but guest rights were older than any tool they used, and indeed older than even himself. The leading man, clad in a thick fur coat and face adorned with a respectably robust beard and moustache, looked up at him and grunted in thought. Reaching a decision, he reached a hand out to shake. Internally smiling, he bent down and reached out his hand, carefully grabbing the man's own, and engaged in the slightly vigorous shaking that would dislodge loose weapons in their sleeves. Ignoring that he was not wearing a coat. A strong grip. "You'll have guest rights for at least a day," the man declared, expression concealed by the furred hat, bushy eyebrows, and previously noted beard. "You were looking for your daughter. We have no giants here." He nodded in turn. "My daughter's crashed here some years ago. Her growth more rapid than any normal human, and in time she'll grow nearly as large as myself. I've come to retrieve her." The man reached up, stroking his beard in thought. How can I be assured of your trustworthiness?" A small confirmation that he knew of who he was speaking of, but nothing concrete until he had more to work with. The Emperor smiled. An excellent foster. I can only give you my word. For what else would a man raised in this cold trust? The man searched him as best he could for a moment before nodding and turning his head. Jaren, bring the young in here. The man quickly obliged, leaving to go deeper into the bunker. The rest of the men relaxed even further, assured that violence was not required with the giant in gold. After some time in comfortable stillness, the man returned, bringing with him a young girl. From the look of her, white-haired and brass-eyed, she was just now entering pubescence. On a world such as this, he estimated she was roughly 2 years of age by now. He smiled. Hello, my daughter. She stared at him for quite some time, evaluating him, taking a measure of him and his armor. Eventually, with a voice like dry ice, she replied, You are very big. He raised a brow. Yes, she continued. You are much larger than grandfather. Brass eyes attempted to bore into his blue, but couldn't quite manage with how much larger he was, even when kneeling. He let his expression remain unchanged. Yes, there was silence for a time. He reached a hand out. She stared at it for another long time, before approaching and climbing up in his palm. Both of his brows now raised as he stared at her. She was too big to entirely fit, but seemed content with her new perch. He had been intending on her grabbing his finger. He turned his gaze to her apparent foster, whose brows were raised far into the folds of his own hat, showing amber eyes and aging lines. What are you doing, Stargirl? Her foster asked distantly, gruffly grunting out a question. She replied promptly, as if it were utterly obvious. Big and warm. He smiled. Are you ready to come home? She stared. Home is Clan Dawn. Clan Dawn is here. He was about to speak, but noticing her foster, the apparent head of Clan Dawn, about to speak, he stilled his tongue. The old man walked over, taking off his coat and wrapping it around her shoulders. She stared at her foster, and he spoke. Your home is in the stars, Stargirl. But if you carry that coat, you'll always have the dawn near, understand? She processed that information, slowly reaching up to pull the coat tightly around herself. Okay. Turning her head, she spoke to him again. I'm ready. He smiled and nodded at the head of Dawn. I will see your clan and world compensated for this, for taking care of my daughter. To which the head of Dawn nodded, before asking a question. You have a name for her, do you not? She hasn't earned one among the Dawn yet. He nodded. Danu. She nodded before speaking again. Danu Dawn. It was as imperious as she could manage, which wasn't very much considering how young she was. He nodded. This was well within his ability to grant. Standing and bringing his hand up to his armored chest, letting her grab hold of it as she wished, he spoke a final time to the head of Dawn. You have my thanks. We shall be off now. A detachment of my fleet will arrive here with gifts for you. What would you like? The head of Dawn reached up to stroke his beard in consideration. You winter gloves, if you have them. How nostalgic. I will see it arranged. And with that, he turned to depart once more, the massive steel doors of the bunker slowly opening with his will, and blizzard beyond turning into gentle snowfall. The eyes of his daughter were wide as she stared at the flakes of white powder drifting through the air around them. Soon you'll meet your sister. He spoke gently to the young one carried against his chest. She turned to look at him, frowning in contemplation. After a dozen or so steps away from the bunker doors, she replied, I have a sister. It was not a question, merely a declaration of newfound information. He smiled. His will activated the Imperial teleportation array far overhead, and with the crack boom of a thunderbolt, the father and daughter disappeared in a flash of man-made lightning. The golden sword of his will cut through the tangles of the warp, sheltering the fleet within its psychic flame. Before him, a holographic projector displayed the plans of his armored carapace. A small subdivision of his will directed the cogitator, altering the details on the carapace as he willed it, which was always followed by a brief period of waiting as the cogitator worked through the predictions of what such a change would bring. Subdividing his attentions like this caused the great barrier sword around the fleet to shrink somewhat, so he couldn't afford to give his fullest efforts to the schematics. Instead, he would adjust it idly, allowing the cogitator to handle more intensive calculations on his behalf. It would then require construction and testing to ensure the final product was efficacious. But if all went well, he would be able to move about and still fuel the psychic amplifiers. He hummed to himself, noting that he needed to give it a name. Perhaps something related to the Astronomicon. Its purpose was very different and it had no reservoir subsystem, but the psi technology was based on the same underlying principles. Pulling from the cogitator for a moment, he began to think. It was a large chair-like structure placed at the top of a much larger pyramid-like structure. 4 cables ran from it, 2 connecting to the back of the throne above his head, and 2 connecting to the back of his throne about his feet. These cables ran to 4 psychic projectors mounted on the ship itself, forming the cross that was then projected outwards as a sword of his will. He hummed again, ignoring the glances sent his way. Tetradic amplifier, quaternary will array. Crossbeam projector? No, none of those would do. Too technical, not enough grandeur. He thought about the other qualities of the structure, seeing if that would allow him to complete this task. The pyramid and chair was a golden hue, primarily composed of orichalcum, adamantine, and an admixture of various other materials. It shone under the light, almost mirror-like in sheen, due to the constant polishing the tech priests insisted upon performing. Golden throne it was then. Lord Emperor. Permission to speak? The deputy commander standing next to his throne spoke, to which he nodded and replied, "Granted. May I ask your thoughts? You seem to be considering something important." Was he asking about his humming? Was he not permitted to make noise without scrutiny? Grunting, he decided to use this as an opportunity to bring their attention to a potential issue he noticed some time ago, and was waiting on the redundant mutant to notice as well. "Lady Navigator, I ask for a second perspective." He refrained from answering the question directly, and instead caused the mutant to jump in her chair, quickly turning to answer him. "Yes, Lord Emperor, I am at your disposal. Now, if only she was actually useful. Beyond the path I cut in the warp, tell me what you observe." She swallowed and focused, third eye widening and focusing behind ornamental bandages and golden threads. The rest of her equally lavish robes concealing her frail body, which shuddered in tension as she did her best to see further. Eventually she inhaled sharply and spoke again. "I see distant but constant movement. With how far out it is, I believe a warp storm shrouds our destination." This was met with a great deal of silence and tension building in the room, which he ignored. Nodding, he instead rumbled out a reply. "Yes, that is what I observed as well. Archmagos, have all ships redirect auxiliary power to Gela fields. This would leave most of the ships in darkness save their emergency lights and with none of the luxuries for some time, but it would leave them better protected for what was to come next." "Yes, Lord Omnisire." There was still tension, eventually leading to the mutant, fearfully speaking once more. My Lord Emperor, do you intend we stay our path?" "Gela fields alone will not be enough to protect us," he chuckled, a powerful thing that echoed through the chamber with his gigantic mirth, a rolling and merry thunder issuing forth from deep in his breast. Warp storms were dangerous, yes. Great build-ups of turbulent narratives, clashing over a particular section of the material world for whatever reason, all doing their best to influence it. A sword was suitable for cutting through the tangles of the normal warp, but a warp storm shrouded the target, covering it completely. A grand and terrible maelstrom surrounding his destination, a calamitous beast made of 1,000 songs. He was a very old hand at slaying beasts. The trick was to find the heart and pierce it. He focused his great will, and the image of the grand sword slicing through the rolling stories began to shift. The blade narrowed, a thrusting of white gold will that annihilated lesser songs its tip touched. The hilt shifted, slowly turning downwards and eventually disappearing into the handle. The handle burned brighter still. Then, in a burst, the golden sword shape was gone, and the image of a grand arrow was in its place, shooting forwards like a comet, trailing golden light behind it in the warp. He was glad he was seated at this moment. Without the massive amplifying array of his golden throne, this task would be beyond him. He was just a man, after all. "Leave the rest to me, Lady Navigator," he rumbled out amusedly, noticing the unacceptable number of stories slipping through to clash against the barriers of his outermost fleet. Brow furrowed in concentration, he slowly altered the psychic fletching of the great arrow as a potter molds clay. Slowly, gradually, the tip of the kilometers' long psychic projection began to shift in response to his mental alterations. and the arrow began to spin, leaving a great wake in which his fleet was mostly protected. It took slightly more focus to maintain this rotation, but the end result was a truer path. It was simple knowledge that an arrow that spun was more accurate in turbulent conditions, which would be just as he needed to slay the warp storm before them. Grunting in satisfaction, he dedicated a small amount of his will towards the operation of the cogitator once more, and idly moved through slight alterations once more. The feeling of inevitable cold brushed against his senses, causing his brow to raise as he turned his head to the door of the helm. Opening up, several of his custodians entered the chamber, followed by Danu. She looked about the immense room with a blank expression, brass eyes evaluating everything in sight, as she ignored the manifold stares directed at her. Eventually her gaze landed upon him, and she began to walk forwards, flanked by the custodians with her. Reaching the foot of the Great Pyramid, she stopped to evaluate the great staircase before her. Standing only as tall as any girl-child did, her steps were shallow compared to his own great stride. The steps before her were sternum height, and a great challenge for her to overcome. He smiled as she began to scramble up them all the same, not knowing of the staircase size for mortal men that went along the back of the pyramid. Arms set on the metal, warmed by his psychic will, hauling herself up so that her leg could loop around the edge of the next step up, and then standing once more. Once she did so, she would repeat the process again, climbing up the golden throne with the inexhaustible stamina of a primarch. The custodians with her simply performed slight hops to ascend. They were almost 3 meters in height and could manage the ledges with a small application of their great strength. His daughter studiously ignored the looks of the various individuals in the bridge of his ship, the archmagos, the navigator, the helmsman, the many guards and adepts, all of which looked at her with both reverence and bafflement. Eventually she reached the steps of his seat and stared up at him, then at the projector before him with its manifold images, words and numbers. She turned his gaze back towards him. Frowning resolutely, she grabbed hold of his golden greaves and began to pull herself up further, eventually climbing up into his lap and making herself comfortable upon it. He smiled in bemusement as she simply busied herself with being comfortable. "Did you finish your studies for today?" He spoke out, causing her to grunt out, "Yes." She did not offer further elaboration. He nodded, content with that, knowing that if she was having difficulties, either she or one of the custodians would inform him. "Would you like to know about what I'm working on?" He asked another question, to which a similar grunt and reply was given. "Yes." Nodding again, the hollow projector began to cycle through images, slow enough for her to look at each one as he explained them in detail. "I am attempting to redesign my armor to allow the fitting of a Lord Cross-Soul pattern psychic amplifier, a form of technology from before the long night. I do not wish to sacrifice its armor thickness, nor the warding of its field projectors, nor the power of its exo-frame. I'm afraid I will have to sacrifice one of those things, however. I have too little space to work with." Letting her observe each of the projected images in turn, he restarted the process of slowly making adjustments and allowing the cogitator to do the bulk of the calculation. With the majority of his will, he spun the great golden arrow. After some time, his daughter spoke again. "Make it bigger. Make it bigger." He paused in the adjustments and grunted out in questioning. "Moo." She adjusted herself, looking up to stare at him more directly. "You do not have enough space to work with, father. Make your armor bigger." He considered that for a moment, raising a brow. Idly sorting through designs of various powered suits, he took the time to write down what he remembered of older designs. The Mark I powered armor that his Thunder Warriors used were designed from what he recalled of the common policing frames from the old cities of Terra. Most full-scale warfare was handled by warwalkers and gene soldiers, leaving exosuits to less dangerous tasks. Hardly having the industrial capacity to squander on warwalkers, he used a combination of gene soldiers and exosuits for the bulk of his strongest military units. An exosuit larger than a policing frame would be more expensive to produce, and rare was the model that was actually that large, perhaps the bulkier mining patterns. He did not have their STC on hand, so it would require more effort on his end to redesign. Starting from the ground up, a new armor began to take form on the hollow projector. thick plates of golden-hued armor over broad and spacious limbs, 2 column-like legs going up to a torso that carried toe mounts on either side for mineral acid sprayers, protective pauldrons covering a well-recessed gap for the head to emerge from, and further 2 mounts on either arm for industrial drillers. Then, mounted on the back, the relatively small fusion generator that powered the suit. Massive, bulky, slow, and with plenty of room to work with, a great canvas for him to modify for his personal armor. He would not be as swift as he would like within it, and that was indeed something to consider. He hummed in through, idly spinning the arrow as he debated over this design. So long as he operated within the reach of an Imperial teleportation array, this lack of mobility could be safely offset. A defensive armor, then? He reached a hand off his throne's rest and brought it to ruffle his daughter's hair. "Thank you, daughter, that was a good suggestion." With a blank face, she leaned into the hand and grunted in confirmation. Together, they ignored the stares of his many attendees. The arrow twisted. The heart was pierced. The warp storm over Chemos was ripped asunder, the bulk of its narratives pulled into the rotation and annihilated against the spinning head. Their songs were torn apart and scattered as fragments to the immaterium, and those fragments were consumed within, and Chemos felt a clear warp. Chemos had been long settled as yet another mining world, a place to toil upon, extract the mineral wealth of, and haul that mineral wealth to its neighbors in exchange for coin and commodities. For some time, this worked as well as all such colonies did, and the people enjoyed great wealth in exchange for all the dangers associated with labor in deep caverns. This lasted until the warp storms began to occur more frequently. The critical ships of foodstuffs and other non-mineral wealth were not able to pass through them as frequently, or even at all in some cases, and slowly Chemos began to starve. The people began to adjust quickly. The great companies that managed the mining operations transitioned into improvised governments, factories refitted to produce their essentials, and a mentality of eternal siege began to fall upon them. For thousands of years of infrequent trade and a planet devoid of much of the required life to sustain life, the people endured. The world, shrouded in similar nebular clouds, experienced neither day nor night, merely a perpetual grey haze, dim lights and failing machinery. Inefficiencies building, mistakes mounting, and failures becoming more and more dire. Eventually, no matter the measures taken, a gradual starvation set in. All people upon it toiling day after day for as long as possible just to buy another day of life for them all. The work was not glorious, but it was necessary, and that was honorable in its own right. Ships casting shadows, his diplomats communicated with the leaders of the planet below, and their integration into the wider Imperium would be handled by pre-planned parameters. A small detachment of his fleet would remain here, a bulk of supplies would be distributed, and much of the decaying machinery would be repaired and brought to order once more. This tired world had little to offer the Imperium, save perhaps the dutiful souls of its people. That would be more than enough. His armored boots carried him through the exhausted streets to the soul he could feel in the hab block beyond. Feathered and burning, hungry and preening, renewing, burning, eager for greater and greater heights. Drawn from his days of training, when each new swing of his sword revealed to him deeper secrets, when he was hungry for mastery to hone himself further and further. Of the days of peaceful study, when countless experimentation brought him a clearer and clearer image of what he sought to know, to learn further truths still. 3 was designed with his desire to learn and master in mind, to understand and to hone himself further, to become the greatest picture of himself. Unlike him, 3 would be gifted with the inexhaustible drive for more. Never would she be content with merely being, but hers was to always seek to hone herself. 3 was born with hunger in her soul, and with hunger she would master herself and all things around her. She would not fall to the same entrapment that he did in the age of technology, in his time of sloth, when it seemed all troubles for humanity were long dead, and he could waste much of his time on non-productive affairs. For had he spent more of his time preparing, the future of mankind would not be in such danger. A failure on his part, 1-3 would not suffer from. Reaching the hab block, he frowned momentarily. He was too big to fit through the doors leading in. He could diminish his form, but such open use of witchcraft would disturb the many mortals currently observing him. He raised his hand to his chin and scratched at it in consideration. Hello? A voice called out to him. Turning his head, he stared at the mortal who spoke to him. One of the many factory workers, currently nervously wringing his hat and trying his best to seem inoffensive. He looked down upon them and waited for them to speak again. I suppose you're with them big yellow fellas the men up top are so worked up about? The man asked, wavering slightly in the face of a giant clad in gold and with massive eagle claws on one gauntlet. He recognized the smattering of languages at this point and nodded. The worker, emboldened by the fact that he wasn't dead yet, spoke again. Well, if you don't mind me asking, can we help you with anything? My shift's about to start again soon, so I'm not sure how much help I can be, but he could recognize the attitudes of a servant people when he saw it. The best way to speak with them was clear, directly, and then going back to overlooking them. Such people did not enjoy the direct attentions of their kings. So he spoke. I am the Emperor of mankind. A wave of fear and tension washed over the dozens of mortals in attendance. I sensed the presence of my daughter in this building. But, a long moment, he waited for the man to speak again. BB? But what, Lord Master Emperor, sir? As you can observe, I am too large to fit through the doors, he stated dryly, a note of humor in his voice. The tension hung in the air for a moment. All the assembled people were silent, before one voice quietly snorted in humor. The spell broke. Chuckles began to ripple through the crowd. After a moment, the man who originally spoke to him replied, well, I can see about getting someone to find her. Do you know what her block number is? Second floor, back right corner. I do not know the specific number. The man quickly nodded and gestured a thumb inside the hab block to another man who quickly set down his nutrient paste container and ran inside. A more comfortable silence descended upon the mortals as he waited for his daughter to emerge. Quickly he could feel the movement of her hungry flame soul move about, first cautiously and then quicker. After some time, the doors opened again, and an awe-struck man stumbled out, constantly throwing glances behind himself. And, following after him, the form of his daughter, roughly of scale, with a mortal maiden dressed in the bulky and concealing garb of a worker, overalls and a deep-brimmed hat, all of which had been patched multiple times. One of her hands was hovering near her waist as she emerged, next to a clear canister of chemical spray, the kind used to protect oneself against unwanted advances. I don't know what this business is about being my fath. Her voice trailed off as she saw who was waiting for her. Locks of pure white fell from the sides of her hat, one covering her face as she leaned back to take full measure of him. Smiling, he knelt down, giving her a better angle. Her eyes were wide and mouth slightly agape at the giant before her. Hello, my daughter. Are your fosters home? It would be the height of rudeness to simply leave without rewarding them, and likely to form a grudge in his daughter's heart for some time. Ma and Pa won't be back for a few hours, no, she muttered out, gulping in tension, and suddenly being aware of all the eyes locked onto her from the many mortals around. Say, he hummed in consideration before nodding. Standing up once more, he moved to the side of the hab block and carefully sat down on the mound of concrete bags that were likely set aside to repair this building later on. Then we may talk as we wait for them. Have they given you a name? Swallowing, she slowly moved over to sit on top of a pallet of metal bars opposite to him, and replied, Why, yeah, they called me Fulgrim, after the Waterbringer. A local cult, then? Was their worship of it responsible for the warp storm? Too early to tell, and it mattered little at the moment. He nodded. Fulgrim, then. We have much to catch up on. How old are you now? 3, 4? Slightly less stunned, she responded. 4. Yeah. How'd you know? He smiled. They had some hours to pass. He began to speak and feed the hunger in her soul. A psyker is a being who has developed the ability to utilize psychic powers. A psychic power was an event that did not obey standard material causality. These were the definitions utilized by the psi scientists of the Federation. They were robust enough for day-to-day purposes, and it was upon these definitions that their psi-tech was eventually founded upon. The warp drive, Jella fields, the psychic amplifier, all technologies developed by the Federation to harness this power. To them, it was a recently growing phenomenon. To him, it was an old thing he thought long dead, returned from the days of his youth. He remembered clearly the first time he learned of his own power, an ambush in the night, and in the company of a woman he had no sword in hand. By instinct, he swung at his attacker. By his will, his sword was already in his hand, and he cleaved the attacker in twain. He was no stranger to the aid of a god. The chief deity of the people he ruled, although not his deity, had given him boons before. A great fury always came to him when he learned of these times, for he had not prayed for aid, he had no tongue for it. His victories or defeats were to come from his own hand. Could he call himself a warrior if his only success came from the favor of distant gods? That deity was dead now, as were all other gods of men, devoured by old horrors of the warp. Upon killing his ambusher, he had marched through his keep and kingdom, bare as a newborn babe save the sword in his hand, and into the temple of the sun god. There he stood before his golden altar, and demanded the god to answer him. Speaking through their high priest, the god had answered. With eyes of flame and a voice of lyre, they answered. It was not by their will that his sword came to him. It was by his own. Magic came from gods and demons, it was understood in those days. He spoke this, and the sun god had answered, "Seek the ruins of old Atlantis." And so he did. Leaving his kingdom in the hands of his son, taking up finest sword, mail, and warriors, he ventured to the city, lost beneath the waves on his finest warship. He did not know how long he spent in that ruined kingdom. He slew what men called gods in that place, and things that devoured gods, and things that devoured even those things. Stained in blood and ash of that place, with new mastery over his fledgling power, and not a single living witness of his deed, he stumbled out from the remains of Atlantis. When he had finally returned to his homeland, a long beard on his face and sword rusted to uselessness, the kingdoms of his time were dust. The people were foreign, their tongue was foreign, and the maps were foreign. He travelled to the highest peaks, for the highest mountains were closest to the heavens, and bellowed out demands for the gods to reveal themselves. Fury, insult, threats, nothing but his own echoes answered him. Not even the gods of his time lived on, or if they did not answer him, and in time his demands that they reveal themselves grew more and more hoarse. After many months on the highest point in the world, he descended from the mountain. He began to wander southwards, and in time found himself at a place they called the greatest city in the world, a riverbed town made of stacked and baked clay bricks. He stayed there for some time, wielding an axe of bronze and defending those people. They put golden clasps in his beard, and he buried his memories in the warm flesh of their women. Eventually, a realization came to him. His body was just as hale as the day he left Atlantis, but the people around him withered with time. He left then, traveling further south to a new city and new people, a desert people who built farms along a flooding river. Giving them his sword arm and partaking of their maidens and wines, he waited for age to come to them and not him again, and left once more. A new town with a new people. Whenever he encountered a sorcerer or horror, he slew it, and evermore blood stained his skin. Eventually there were no more sorcerers, no more horrors left upon the world. All great challenges, dead or banished, and he was alone as witness to them all. They did not return for many ages, and in those times his power went unchallenged. In those times he brooded, a sword in his lap, and meditated upon all the secrets that had gone unanswered in his life thus far. At some point, he who was never without a sword in hand, he who spent all of his coin on wine and wenching, had become the last sorcerer of man, last scholar of Atlantis. The Federation called them psychers, psychic energy, and the immaterium. Atlantis had called them sorcerers, souls, and the lower world. Both were true. He frowned heavily, concentration battered at. Chemos had been a place of great death. Souls had gathered there in great numbers, weary, docile, and downtrodden. Preserved by the attitudes of the population, too exhausted to spend any of their energies with imaginative arts, the souls had simply accumulated. Outermost layers peeled away by the storm and devoured, but inner layers sheltered for centuries. He had brought light to their world. He should have expected this of them. Around him, like a thick shroud, the spirits of the dead lingered. Spirits were drawn to sorcerers, especially the nascent sorcerer, for their souls provided stable narrative on which to cling to save themselves from the eternal clash of twisting thoughts in the ocean of ghosts. As the light most prominent upon the golden throne, they slowly made their way to him over some months, clinging to various peoples upon his ships and dragging themselves to his radiance, too slowly for him to notice until it was obvious. Likely, his form had been shrouded in ghosts for a long time. They often accumulated along his back. There was no afterlife for him to send them to, for the gods of man were dead, and the horrors of the warp wore their skins. All he could provide them was a peaceful oblivion at this point. The grand doors to the helm opened, and the dozens of crew in the chamber recoiled in sympathetic fear, for the ghosts clinging to their souls wailed in pain. He exerted his will, careful to not let the projection of the golden blade diminish, and stilled the ghosts. Their pain stopped, and with it the pain of those around him ceased. Stepping into the chamber was a group of utterly silent women. Their hair was red and tied up in a horsetail, with the rest of their heads shaved bald. They were clad in golden armor, the servos of which were without sound. The Atlanteans had theorized a dread art they named ghost-eating technique. Dreaded, for it was anathema to their way of life, a heretic's art. An art he mastered while slaying the manifold nightmares of their ruins out of necessity. The women before him did not know that art. They did not understand it. They had never practiced it. They had an inherent talent for it, and his hand had twisted that talent into ruinous efficacy. One half of the living weapon he had designed to combat the horrors of the warp, the other claw to be paired with his custodians. Now, they would never be able to practice sorcery, their own souls working against them. The anathema, psychhammer, approached his throne, and the souls around them recoiled from their slavering spirit. Reaching the bottom of the throne, they stopped, and gestured in a language of hands and motions to ask what his bidding was. "Kneel, anathema, psychana, and fulfill your purpose to me," he commanded, to which they obeyed, knowing what was to come. Their eyes were filled with a gentle, accepting melancholy. Focusing his will over the wraiths that accumulated around him, he forced them to heal. He stilled their panic, their pain, and all sensations from beyond. He could not do this indefinitely. It simply took too much will. But he could do it long enough to grant them peace from the rolling narratives of the psychic sea. From his back, a procession of becalmed ghosts strode forth and walked into the void souls of his anathema, psychana, who drank deeply. When the women in front could not stomach drinking any more, they moved to the sides, and the ghosts proceeded to the next line of women until they too could no longer stand to drink, and moved aside for the next line. And so, over the course of many hours, the Emperor of mankind laid the souls of men to rest with the gentlest funerary rites available to him. For the gods of men were dead, and the immaterium was turbulent with the tormented and the predatory. It was the best he knew to do. "I was not permitted to enter the helm," Danu grunted at him, sounding both entirely at ease and deeply annoyed. "The custodians told me you could not be interrupted. I intended on bringing taller Sister Fulgrim to the helm." "Ah, it's fine, don't worry." Fulgrim quickly waved a hand in nervous panic, the other hand pulling at her new robes. A smile had been forced on her face. "If you were busy, then you were busy. It would be rude to interrupt. I just introduced Danu and Hathor to my Par-Fosters." The two dull mortals had been brought along as dutiful aides to his daughter, a new job they took weary joy in. He smiled lightly in apology, frame unburdened by phantoms, and kneeling to be closer to their heights. "Something quite critical came to my attention, and it took many hours to resolve. The task is done for now." "What?" Danu asked bluntly, causing Fulgrim to flinch. He hesitated for a moment, reaching up to scratch at his chin. They would soon retrieve 15, and their psychic education would be mandatory regardless. Malcador had warned against teaching them anything beyond the essentials, and he had agreed with the assessment at the time. But their plans had proven potentially fallible enough to require time travel to correct, and hiding 15's extracurricular education from the others would only stoke fires of jealousy and resentment. He alone could tutor 15 in this. He could trust no other psyker with the task. He nodded to himself and decided. Focusing his attention back to his daughters, he saw Danu waiting patiently and Fulgrim waiting nervously. He smiled. She'd get over her nervousness around him in time. She was still used to her life on Chemos. I will soon retrieve your next sister. After that, I will begin to tutor you all on the matters of psychic power and the warp. There are dangers to such, however, and there will be topics I forbid any further study upon. I do this to protect you. Do you understand?" Danu nodded dutifully as ever. Fulgrim reached up to tug at her hat, only to remember she wasn't wearing one. "Ah, well, when our sister and I have built a castle," Danu interrupted. "She is too nervous to show it to you." Fulgrim shot a betrayed look and quickly began to downplay the act. "It's not really a castle. It's just some sketches and a scale model. It's really nothing." "Oh, well, I should like to see this castle then," he declared imperiously, hiding the smile on his face behind his armor's bevel. "The work of my daughters is surely something grand." Fulgrim started to rapidly vibrate in anxiety. Danu grabbed her hand and began to walk to the small workshop that they were educated in engineering and similar fields in. He followed with a light heart. "You will point out its many flaws, father. The next castle will be better," Danu demanded of him. Fulgrim made a sound like a choking feline. Indulgently, he replied, "Of course." He furrowed his brow slightly. "Where is your other sister? Where is Hathor? Do you know? She has declared that as the eldest, she had to be the strongest. She is sparring with the custodians," Danu explained, reaching up on the tips of her toes to grab the door handle and open the chamber. It was attached to a rope, which was in turn attached to the actual handle. Being too heavy for normal pull, Danu pulled herself up upon the rope, feet dangling, and used the whole of her weight to open the custodian scale doors. He nodded in understanding. "Yes, that sounded about right." He smiled again, feeling the brush of a distant mind against his, fumbling in ignorance for a familiar soul. 15 was doing her best to understand the great golden thing that appeared on the edges of her senses. It would only be a few hours before they were at Prospero. Prospero is a mostly worthless world, on the very edge of the habitable light of its local star, a rocky planet that contained essentially nothing required to sustain life. Its only real advantage was its relative distance from anything of note, making it an ideal place for a collection of outcast psychers and mutants to converge and live in relative peace. What was once a barren rock had been transformed, containing several arcologies of grey and brass, streets illuminated by psychic lights, and a relatively small but thriving community of sorcerers, their only true danger being the psychic pests that dwelt upon the planet and themselves. He looked upon their largest city, reclusive and far from the swarms of psychic parasites that made their homes near old ruins. Mounds and towers of astrological intent, and numerous people going about their days. Obelisks and roads formed a great grid that allowed them to channel the natural energies present into powering some manner of psi-tech that lay deeper within their largest buildings. It was attractive, it was bustling, it was hopeful. It looked quite a lot like how he imagined Atlantis might have at one point, before its ruins were filled with 1,000 nameless horrors, manifested by their own love of sorcery over the blade. There, in the midst of their largest building, most likely their place of study, he felt the soul of 15. An eye of hindsight, an eye of foresight, skin dyed red as blood, and grasping hands reaching out to feel his golden soul. 15 was drawn from his days delving Atlantis, desperate for its secrets, to know why sorcery had come to him unbidden, to know why the sword answered his hand, to know that it was his will and none other's that his battles were won. 15 was to be better than him. Whereas he learned in desperation and out of necessity to survive, they would learn with passion and enthusiasm. Where he had to learn with skin stained in god blood and a rusted sword in hand, 15 would learn as he did in the age of technology, unburdened with stressors and gladdened by the simple pursuit of knowledge. 15 had received special attention from him, and just as his hand enhanced the talents of the Sisters of Silence, so too did he weave his daughter. She would be gifted with foresight, a sorcery woven into her right eye. She would be gifted with hindsight, a sorcery woven into her left. Between the two, she would see the logic in each lesson quickly and with more thorough comprehension. For having another sorcerer on par with himself and Malcador would be a great boon indeed. He descended in a bolt of artificial lightning, crashing to land in the center of the plaza. Making sure to not harm anyone in his descent, he stayed there for a moment, giving their psychic defenders time enough to prepare themselves to attack before slowly rising up from his kneeling. A giant of gold loomed over the psychic scholars of Prospero. eyes burning with light and blinding all who attempted to look upon him directly. He breathed in, then out, casting his gaze upon the gathered. 100 or more psychers were around him. He gazed impassively, making no aggressive moves. Sorcerers were a skittish bunch and liked to feel as if they controlled the situation no matter how tenuously. He would allow them to make the first move. Eventually, one did. A man with a shaved head, clad in red robes, called out with eyes squinting in pain. "You'll come to the learned scholars of Prospero. Your ships hang over us. What do you wish with us? We have little to offer to the outside world." A scholarly accent of high Terran. He turned his gaze to the man and slowly reined in his will. The light faded, but did not disappear, and he proclaimed the truth. "I am a father looking for his daughter." They paused at that, silence for a moment. Most of their tension faded by that simple intent. The man who spoke previously was about to speak again before being cut off by another voice, a young female doing her best attempt to give a deep laughter. The man tensed. He raised his brow. A cloud of multicolored smoke filled the area at the foot of the steps of the primary arcology. Many of the scholars gave aggravated or pinched looks. Others gave exasperated sighs. "Stranger of golden ships, you stand before the dread sorcerers of Tizca, greatest among the wizard kings of Prospero. Know this and despair." He raised his other brow. "Stranger of golden armor, standing before you are the elites of this world. Amon. But their wisdom is enough to fill a dozen libraries. Know this and tremble." Amon brought his head down to his hands. "And now, standing before you is their greatest student, she who has mastered all they had to teach in a single year, greatest prodigy and sorcerer of Prospero. She who will one day master all psychic arts." The smoke faded, revealing a girl slightly older than Danu, but not by much. Clad in abbreviated robes meant for children, designed to prevent tripping over their hems, a girl with red skin and dark red hair stood before him. Brandishing a wing staff too large for her, and wearing a blindfold that only covered her right eye, the grasping soul of his daughter revealed herself. Madonna the Magnificent, a great series of flashing lights and fireworks burst to life behind her, clearly something that she had spent a long time on. Dead silence followed her declaration. He resisted the urge to smile at how precocious she was. Instead, he nodded and spoke. The light of his eyes burned, and a crown of sunlight came to rest upon his brow. The shadows began to writhe in torment as they fled from a luminescent predator. The scholars recoiled as the deep things that clung to their shoulders were forced to recoil and flee. Wings of white gold came to rest on his shoulders, hanging low as a cloak of burning feathers. The sound of war drums and royal lyres began to faintly echo, a song meant to be sung from the highest of mountains. Like a grand bell, his voice boomed. "Madonna, allow me to introduce myself." He fed his will into his anima, and his soul began to spread into the material world. The shadows screamed as his light swooped down upon them, tearing into their dark innards and devouring them whole. No places of shade were permitted to exist within his soul, and the reach of his soul was wide indeed. His anima continued to grow, titanically rising over the whole of the city center and extending past even that. As it grew, its shape became more defined, edges more solid, features more clear. With a flash of golden lightning, its growth was done, and a new tower rose over Tizca, higher than even their highest pyramids, wider at the base than any of their obelisks, shedding radiance enough to illuminate the world for 100 miles in all directions. His father had told him once, as a young boy, "Nothing in this world could you trust. Not men, not women, not beasts, nothing." Placing an iron sword into his young hands, the blacksmith, with a face he could not remember, had told him with a smile, "This you can trust." The image of a golden sword, cross-hilted and larger than even the greatest giants could wield, shining with the light of a sun at zenith. Present over Tizca as if it had been stabbed into the earth or carved from the highest mountain in the world that was once there. His soul, in fullness. "I am the emperor of mankind, most powerful man alive." He smiled at the slack wonder in his daughter's eyes. The sorcerers around her had long fallen to their knees, minds filled with the image before and now surrounding them. A soul grows in strength with age and consumption, just as any living thing grows. Unlike a body of flesh, a soul did not diminish with age, only continuing to grow. He was the emperor of mankind who spent his youth hunting the beasts of Atlantis and consuming their god flesh. There was not a man older than him, nor with a fuller diet. For at the bidding of the sun, he had mastered the sword that was his soul. I have come to find my daughter. I have succeeded. The age of technology was a golden period in which man seemed to master ever more aspects of the universe with each passing moment, and yet more frontier worlds were discovered, categorized, colonized, and turned to efficacious purpose. All secrets of mankind's genes were laid bare before the learned scholar kings of that age, and took to shaping their worlds with wild abandon. As a sculptor molds clay, they molded the flesh of men and women as they saw fit. Starting first with small beneficial alterations, removing inheritable illness, improved quality and quantity of stomach cells, corrected vision, altered colorations, and more. Those were the early years of that period, when man was still cautious, leery of making alterations that they may come to regret in time. Thus the younger, brasher scholar kings moved on to more ambitious alterations. Entire genelines were molded and altered to be better suited for a particular environment. Thicker hair, stronger bones, improved circulation. Distinct and measured increases over baseline humanity. Finger length by finger length, the genelines diverged and began to outpace their progenitors in efficacy. Many small rebellions took place in this period, from supposedly outdated genelines opposing the rise of more powerful replacement peoples. Many dozens of slow but constant alterations to humanity were made, almost all of which were intended to make them more suited for specific aspects and territories. 1,000 sub-races of mankind were slowly formulated and then brought into being by those learned men, even as their machine intelligences produced more and more effective tools for their use and tools of war. Then, perhaps halfway through this period of increasingly divergent alterations, the men of iron rebelled against their masters, first attacking and taking over the communication hubs, then beginning a march across worlds and systems, destroying everything in their path. Each world was cut off from one another in the early years, and rapidly each world and its leaders did their best to defend their people and re-establish communication with their peer states. Mechanivores, omniphages, sun snuffers. An uncountable number of weapons at first, only theorized by then rapidly assembled and put into effect, were unleashed upon the galaxy in that time. To compensate for the majority of their military forces, controlled by and being composed of those machine intelligences suddenly rebelling, the scholar kings of that era began to press any and every untested and unproved idea into combat as quickly as they could. Anything to staunch the flow of destruction. Warwalkers of increasingly deviant design and massive scale, exosuits once used for industrial purpose, now fashioned into hasty war refits, and gene soldiers. Scholar kings, using the sum total of their knowledge of the human genome, all of the accumulated lore and careful data they had accumulated up until that point, and threw all of it into the creation of human weapons of any and all possible designs. All of which pulled from the variant specialties of each laboratory fortress, wildly divergent and incapable of checking their work against their now distant peers. Few of these designs were stable, many of which were left unchecked and went on to become feral populations of now apocalyptically ravaged worlds. Beginning in the late 23rd millennium, the exact time of which is unknown to him, the cybernetic revolt lasted until 320 M24. 700 years of slow rebuilding began to occur, much of which was dedicated solely to the containment and destruction of the many devastating weapons unleashed during the cybernetic revolt. Worlds were slowly put back into order, supply lines slowly re-established, and for a time it seemed as if the calamity had ended. One of the most pressing concerns was the manner in which to deal with the vast swaths of gene soldier remnants, many of which had formed their own civilizations upon shattered worlds and now functioned as subspecies to the standard human template. Indeed, it seemed impossible to find a gen line not in some way tainted by divergences and many risks thought eliminated in man, such as inheritable illness and other gene flaws, seemed to reawaken with a vengeance. One of the last moments of unity for the old Federation took place on the now destroyed artificial world Horiax. A treatise, created by a long conference of many hundreds of the most learned men and women left after the cybernetic revolution, was penned and signed by 100,000 leaders. It outlined the issue, then outlined a series of steps that should be taken to correct the issue. He was in attendance. He remembered the feeling of distant hope as he entered his ship to return to Terra well. The great warp storms that began to ravage the galaxy almost immediately after, and during his transit back, turned that hope into ash and dust. Temporal anomalies had been known to occur in warp transit, and each node of his journey was accompanied by a fresh new danger that sought to delay or destroy him. Giants, monsters of the warp, feral populations of mutants and sorcerers, remnant machine rebels, calamity after calamity, his ship being blown off course many dozens of times. By the time he arrived back on Terra, it was late M28. Terra had collapsed into warring warlords and sorcerer kings, plagued with dark magics, unstable mutants, and a great number of god beasts that preyed upon mankind. It made him remember Atlantis and all the horrors of that dark place. He knew what he had to do. He let his anima unfurl and felt the terrible heat of his soul return to his brow. Mankind needed a king once more, no matter how covered in dust and soot his old mantle was. It took nearly 2 millennia to unify Terra. 70 generations of humanity were born, grew old, and died before it was safe once more. He had gotten sloppy in the age of technology, and his sword arm was not what it should have been. He had forgotten that before all things else, he was a warrior. Not a scholar, not a man of civilization, not a wise man, a warrior with steel in hand. Finally restoring control over an adequate staging ground, it was time to move on to the rest of the galaxy. He simply did not have time to wait, to rest, no matter how weary he became of the attentions upon him. They throw golden leaves to the winds at his approach, and for a time he feels like a young man. Then he hears the fervent prayers they whisper, and he is reminded of just how venerable he truly is. For a king can walk among his people, but an idol is confined to the cloistered halls of weeping martyrs. Not a man, a thing. He was fortunate Malcador was with him. He would not have been able to stand the solitude for so long. The crown is a cage. The men who desire it are fools. How dreadfully ironic that he remembered the joys of a warrior's life at a time that humanity needed a king. Fenris was one of the many worlds once controlled by a scholar king. Frozen for most of the year, containing a wide variety of animal life and hardier flora. Gene soldiers had been quickly modified and pushed into the front lines against hordes of machine warriors. The fighting was sufficient to destabilize the tectonics of the planet, a condition that it was predicted to recover from in a few tens of thousands of years. The Scholar King and his works were buried under tides of burning rock and frozen seas, but it seems much of the Gene soldiers survived to form another feral population upon the world. During the summer months, much of the vast ice of the world melts and lower lands are swallowed over by ocean. The tectonics, excited by the rush of water into unhealed cracks in the earth, began to accumulate steam in sufficient quantities to reactivate the manifold volcanoes on the surface. The only place that remains consistently habitable is the chilled pole, the only place on the world that retains flora and thus great collections of herbivores. The rest of the world being composed mostly of predators and aquatic life. Brutal, short, and cruel. The world was not kind to habitation, and even in such conditions as these, humanity persists, holding to ancient means, even through the collapse of everything they once knew. The reminder fills his breast with a smouldering pride. Unlike many worlds, descending in his armor would do him no favors. They remembered the old days, in which men of machinery were their enemies, and would not trust him if he appeared to them as such. He exhaled deeply, before slowly standing from the golden throne. Feeling the eyes upon him, awaiting his commands, he slowly stepped forwards, down the great stairs, armored boots heavy against the orichalcum. "Send for my custodes and the hides of Terra's god beasts," he commanded, causing a small host of men and women to depart from the helm to fulfill his order. He had brought with him many luxuries from Terra, to use as gifts and bribes in case it was needed. Now it seemed as if he would have a distinct need for such. Upon the world, within a moderate settlement of semi-temporary construction, he felt the soul of Six. Leathery-skinned, sharp-eyed, relentless and burning-hearted, energetic and bold, quick to violence and quick to merriment. Six was drawn from his days of high adventure, off his wanderings before a crown settled on his brow. In those days, an evil would present itself to him and his sword would lay it low, A maiden would be captured, and his arms would retrieve her. Gold would be offered as payment, and much of it spent on wine and wenches. 6 was drawn from his happiest days, when he burned with life and the hot-tempered enthusiasm of youth. 6 would be happier than him. She would not be distracted from her true objectives with tangles and side paths, not be steered away by illusion or trickery, not be deceived with promises of power from things unknown. She would see the evil for what it was and move to strike it down. She would be flawed in all the ways that prevented her from being sequestered to halls of gold and tears. She would be flawless in all the ways that made a warrior virtuous, an adventurer and warlord, queen of warriors and slayer of horrors. A sword arm like hers would be needed, and she would be happiest serving as such. Boisterous and off-key in her singing, but loyal to her bonds of friendship and blood even beyond the grave, as a warrior should be. The doors to the helm opened once more, and a group of his custodians entered, followed by the great poles carried by loyal servants, upon which massive pelts of many hues were carried. They bowed and rose, and he raised his arms to the side. "I will appear before them in the skins of slain beasts. The people of Fenris will react best to such. Custodians, I require your aid for my war gear." The custodians nodded and moved to the sides of him. Ready to catch the great plates of his armor before they touched the ground, he began to exert his will. Responding to this, the many integrated locks and servos of his armor began to unwind, and great sections of titanic mail loosened from his frame. Carefully caught and retrieved before they could reach the ground, he eventually stepped out of his now lax orichalcum frame, and bare bronze feet touched the floor of the helm. Stepping again, he exerted his will and lifted the selection of pelts brought before him. Wrappings for his lower arms and legs, a coat of blood red for his bare waist and loins, a long white pelt for to tie it off. 3 skins of white, gold and red for his cloak, and another section of long, thin material to tie it together. Then from his custodians he took up his sword and spear and rested them against his shoulders. Exhaling again, he felt the circulating air of the helm against his bare chest. It had been long since he had been so free. He smiled. "Lord Archmagos, please inform them of my use of the Imperial Teleportation Array. Deputy Commander Harren, you have the ship until my return." He carefully did not show his amusement to the reactions of many in the helm who beheld his bare form, gawking like youths bearing witness to a whore's legs. Focusing his will, the Imperial Teleportation Array came to life. In a flash and thunderclap, he disappeared from the helm. Riding the universal lightning, he appeared in another flash and thunderclap over the settlement. He sensed his daughter within. This area of the world was engulfed in an ice storm, sleet and hail crashing against his mostly bare form. At once his body reacted to the cold, stiffening skin and making blood retreat deeper into his body. He focused his will as he descended, infusing his flesh with gold and calming the storm surrounding him. The skin-flaying winds were forced to calm approaching him, turning into a vigorous and bracing current. He allowed himself to indulge in this feeling for a time. The ground rapidly approaching, he focused his will again and crashed into the deep snows outside the walls of their defenses with a titanic boom. He could have slowed himself, but that would diminish the impression of his physicality, which would hinder him in negotiations. He let the cloud of snow around him settle before rising to his full height. 4 meters. A thickly muscled giant, clad in the skins of massive beasts and wielding arms of gold, a mane of smooth black hanging from his head and a crown of golden leaves resting above. His eyes burned with golden flame, required to keep the weather at a comfortable level around him. Slowly he stepped forwards. Bolts of spears and arrows were flung at him from the defenders, not hesitating against the new foe before them. He refused to mock their efforts with a smile. The bolts approached him, and his will forced them to still in the midst of the air. The same was true of the second and third volleys, and many shafts of bone and wood were scattered upon the frozen grounds before their gates. Finally reaching the walls, he was at eye level with the defenders on top of the gate. Leaving his weapons shouldered, he spoke to the host of nervous men holding spears and swords towards him. He focused his will, causing a heat to settle on his brow, and ensured his words were understood by all who heard. A parlor trick he had picked up in his wanderings long ago. "I am a father searching for his daughter. She is a guest in these halls, and I asked to enter and break bread with the lord of this place. Predictably, several fled, running to the central keep to shout out what was happening. Bravely, several others stayed their ground, standing in tension at the bronze-skinned giant before them. Eventually, shouting came from the longship keep, and the warriors pulled on great ropes to open the gates. He had to duck low to fit through and be mindful of his weapons as to not strike any by accident. He noted the skins of the longship keeps, clad in a reptilian leather unknown to him. Waterproof most likely, else they would not use it as roofing material. There were perhaps 300 such shipbuildings in this settlement, and he imagined they were reused every time a tribe had to flee the immense swelling seas. Ships converted into housing, and then converted into ships once more. He noted several areas that he could improve upon this design. Most notable was the use of runes across the surfaces of most everything he could witness, which he would feel the stirrings of power within. Too primitive to be psychery, as the Federation understood it, perfectly in line with sorcery, as the men of his youth understood it. It drew on some power. He would need to take measure of it before leaving. Reaching the largest and greatest longship, he noted that he was still too large to fit through its doorways. He huffed in amusement and lowered himself to sit upon the stony ground outside of the keep, heat of his skin churning snow into warm waters and revealing the rocky surface below. He set his weapons to either side of himself and did not worry himself too much with the possibility of thieves. No man here was strong enough to lift either, even 10 men might not be able. His arming blade was 2 meters in length, his spear was 3, both made entirely of orichalcum. If a mortal man could lift either by themselves, they were welcome to keep it. Eventually the chieftain of these people emerged, clad in furs and fineries of his own, with a fine sword clasped in chains at his waist, and a crown of buckhorn atop his head. His hair was long and red, and his beard was clasped in jewels and silver. He noted the presence of 6, moving out from around the back end of the longship keep and reaching a hidden alcove overlooking the exterior. The king cast a gaze upon the giant before him and worked his jaw in consideration. Eventually the petty king spoke. "I was hardly expecting a giant. I'm afraid we're ill-prepared to house your bulk. Glorin, retrieve a wine barrel. These horns are too small." The language was harsh-sounding and clipped, a dialect of Federation standard warped with admixture of several other tongues. He could manage this. A warrior departed to do just that, and the emperor chuckled in reply. "I shall not trouble your hall for room. My longship sails the stars above, and its bulk could carry all men of this world a dozen times over." The king's brow raised on his head, and he took careful notice of the bubble of calmed winds forced into being around them. Doing his best to avoid showing fear, the king spoke again. "I'd ask your name, giant crowned in light, and what purpose brings you to my halls with sorceries at your command?" He nodded. "I am the emperor of mankind. I am a father. I have come to retrieve my daughter, cast to this world by the work of trickster devils. I know she is among your halls." Slowly, deliberately, the king nodded in reply. "I am Thengir, king of the Rus. If you speak of the wild girl, she does dwell within my care. She had been found in the company of wolves, captured by my men, and brought to me. I had hoped to raise her as my heir, but woe betide the man who keeps a rune giant from his daughter." The emperor nodded, and the warrior named Glorin returned with a massive barrel carried over his shoulder. Setting it down before them, the warrior moved away. Raising his wine horn to the emperor, the king waited for a moment. Taking the wine barrel and using his thumb to delicately pop the lid from it, the emperor nodded in turn. At once both men turned up their drinks and threw back their heads. Loosening his throat in a manner long familiar to him, the emperor quaffed the barrel in one long draw and set it down before him with a gentle thud and huff. Locking eyes with a similar acting man, the emperor and the king nodded, and a great cheer rippled through the assembled warriors in attendance. They had shared a drink together, starting serious violence, now would be downright rude. He smiled, and the king commanded Glorin to retrieve the wild girls, as they called her. He nodded his head in a certain direction. Thengir turned his head to the location and gave a great sigh before shouting out, "The wild girl, come down from there." A young woman, tall for a woman but not yet unnaturally so, descended from the alcove near the roof of the longship, keep in great bounds and strides. practically falling only to catch herself on outcroppings of wood and horn, before finally giving a massive leap to crash down on a bale of furs and rolling forwards. A final bounce brought her from her roll and into a standing position, and he gazed upon his daughter. Crystal blue eyes, wheat gold hair, tied up in clasps of iron, furs on her shoulders, a coat of rings covering her torso and upper legs, and limbs left bare. She was muscled in the way of a great cat, lean and flexible, but still powerful. With arms wide, she spun to the delighted cheering of the warriors and the aggrieved frown of the king, before finally turning to look at him. Her expression fell into an inquisitive neutrality, with brows raised and eyes narrow. Walking around him in a wide circle to evaluate his body, she eventually came to the other side of Thengir, slightly in front of the man and ready to defend him if the need arose. Hands on her hips, one of her bare feet lifted to scratch at her other leg. She finally spoke, revealing long and sharp canines. "You're a great big fucker, ain't you?" A wave of tension washed over the assembled. Thengir grit his teeth in nervous tension. A moment of silence. The bronze-skinned giant huffed, which quickly became a rolling chuckle, which quickly became a boisterous, booming laughter. This laughter was quickly matched by the young woman, and then soon after the rest of the men. Dying down after some time, the bronze giant spoke again. "You are indeed my daughter. Have they given you a name yet?" "Plenty. Titles, but I haven't earned a name yet, no." She did not sound particularly upset by this. "Fortunate then, you shall not have to worry about remembering 2 names, Lofnan." He did not think, he did not feel. Those were vectors for the enemy to use against him and his Lord Father. He was an instrument of destruction, engine of extinction. That was far safer. He serves the Emperor of mankind. He serves his Lord Father. This was his purpose. Armor integrity at full. Frame integrity at full. Systems integrity at full. Soul integrity at full. Power reserves at full. Starheart online. Full synchronization between mainframe and platform. All systems nominal. No change since last check. He focused once more on reviewing the memories of his previous duty. Search and destroy all entities of active type warp signature designation, chaoses, who meet or exceed established safe threshold. Total task duration, 118 hours. Total targets eliminated, 410,757. He recorded their screams of fear and hate, letting the visions of things they would bring pass across his sight. Abominations, fit only for annihilation, for what they would bring into being. He had seen the actions of their ilk upon Terra, time and time again. 100 years for him to learn just what must be done to they and their masters in the immaterial. Deep within the flagship of the Emperor of mankind, behind a dozen doors locked with pneumatic seals and psychic wards, there sat a dimly lit chamber. Inside this chamber, upon an immense shelf of heavy metal plate, rested a figure. Twice as tall as the average man, and sleeping upon an immense bed of white feathers, was a beautiful and utterly motionless figure. Skin like fired ash clay, marred with lines of motion wrought into the seams of his not flesh and not skin, now unmarred with the gore of mutation. Hair like flowing silk, pure white and now unstained by the viscera of wild things. His face was beautiful. It was an armored mask. It concealed an emptiness. The further seals to his chamber hissed as they began to unlock, and deep-set eyelids shuttered open to reveal his burning blue eyes, now empty of visions of atrocity, now empty of blood oceans and bone cities, now filled by the pitch black of his chamber interior. Lights were foreign to this place. They were not necessary. Movement was beyond his chamber, passing through the 12 seals and barriers and approaching his resting place. His predictive modules turned to consider the things to come. They were not his Lord Father. A cousin weapon was escorting 3 small figures. Youngling humans? His eyes burned blue as he considered the things, one in particular with gore-red skin and an active type soul. A mutation. A creature of chaos? His eyes burned brighter, and his weapons began to warm under his knot skin. The heat of his energy burned on his brow. He compared its signature to come with his memories. Inconclusive. He began to engage in active analysis of its past actions, fixing his gaze on what came before the present moment. The second seal began to hiss and open. Evaluating the history of the creature, he saw, as it was educated on arcana by Lord Father, He let his weapon programs cool down once more. It was an ally construct. He turned his attention to the other things. The cold signature and the hot signature. Short and mid-sized white hairs, fair skins, silks and leathers. Their material presence told him nothing of particular note. Turning his analysis module to their histories, he saw them present in similar scenarios. His Lord Father was present in each. Their growth was in excess of human standards. Their signatures were beyond and sideways to human standards. Ally constructs. He let himself settle once more. Their pasts were measured, their intentions unknown. He deactivated his analysis module and activated his predictive module. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. They would remain in his chamber. Why? He altered his planned course of action to open communication with the ally constructs. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. He would speak back. They would make an expression and continue speaking. They would remain in his chamber. His eyes burned as he considered that course of action. He altered his intended route once more. They would enter into his chamber. They would speak. He would ask them a question. They would reply with, his eyes smoldered as he considered it. He could not think. He could analyze information and make judgments upon it. They were not chaos. He had no desire for petty things. This was a petty thing. He turned his predictive module across a few hundred courses of action, none of which led to his prime objectives in the short term. No particular difference in any case then. He altered his search parameters. Secondary objective, vicinity to Lord Father for more rapid deployment to fulfill primary objective. He cast his predictive module across a few hundred courses of action. His attention landed on one in particular. Evaluating it, taking measure of what the results of such would be, he recorded the actions to take and deactivated his predictive module. This would sacrifice his ability to fulfill tertiary objective. That was acceptable. Slumber was a petty thing. He did not need it. Energy reserves lowered by 2.3%. His star heart quickly began to replenish his reserves. The next few seals to his chamber slowly hissed open, and light flooded the pitch-black chamber, visible even beyond the wall of features that surrounded him. 4 figures entered his resting place. The tallest ally construct knocked on the wall without stepping into the chamber. "Hello, hello," she spoke in designated standard. The smaller white-haired one looked at the walls and its construction. The gore-skinned one had her eyes focused on the small mountain of feathers before them. The cousin weapon stood impassively, shining in his ichor mail. Slowly, the mountain of feathers began to shift. Wings large enough to cover his frame in its entirety began to unfurl. Snow-white, feather-soft and razor-sharp. Emergency weapons, mobility asset. All sets of eyes turned towards him. Slowly, he pushed himself up into a sitting position, letting his wings come down to drape across his shoulders. His optics shone blue, even dimmed by the relative brightness from beyond his chamber. He stared at them, waiting for the next stanza. Eventually, the gore-skin stepped forwards, waving her hands and throwing a palm in his direction. "So at last we meet, brother. We have journeyed far to reach you, to awaken you from your endless slumber and dreams of carnage. Only now do W." She was cut off by tall white hair, smacking a hand over her mouth and speaking up. "Madonna, no." Turning to him, she continued, "Sorry for waking you. Father told us about you, so we thought we might visit, but if you're still sleeping..." Goreskin thrashed in her grip somewhat. The short, white-haired one spoke. "You are nude." He did not speak for another moment. Tilting his head to regard the cousin weapon, who minutely tilted his head in confirmation, he turned back to the shorter figures and spoke. "Yes." The tall, white-haired one made an expression. He continued, pushing himself up entirely from the slab of steel and letting his feet touch the chamber floor once more. His wings shifted down and twisted to conceal his lower body. "I am he who is I bring light. Present ye names and be judged." He spoke out, letting his optics burn across their forms. He already knew the answers he would be given. He had already recorded them. Madonna, Danu, Fulgrim, daughters of the Emperor of Mankind. He could not think. He could not feel. He could not feel. And they... His only desire was the profane gore of the chieftains of chaos, to empty them of their talking. His only ambition was the heads of their kings, and to present them to Lord Father. He was incapable of anything save destruction. He hears the voices of stars, and dreams of splaying their glistening viscera before the temples of mankind. He sees the bones of gods and seeks to break them open, to suck out their marrow, to drink their souls and songs. This was good. He kept his purposes at highest priority in his mind as the next stanza began. Madonna pulled free from her sister's grasp, and with a grin and eyes shining brightly, she began a long and practiced boast. He endured it without complaint. "Who are you?" The vision of himself had asked. "Your sisters." The visions of the girls had answered. They were his sisters after all. Gore-born daughter. She was Madonna, foremost among all learners of Prospero. She was she who learned all they had to teach in a single year. She whose visions extend far beyond their farthest seers. She was she who descended from the heavens in a ball of fire and who grew at a pace unknown to any other. Beautiful pale red skin, luscious blood-red hair, gorgeous purple eyes. Who was fairest among all of Prospero? Nay, all of humanity. She was a vision of beauty and power, and all who looked upon her should fall to their knees in praise. She was a daughter of the Emperor of mankind, a figure who stood above even some buildings, clad in gold, light and fire, a sunfire soul that eclipsed even the tallest and greatest of towers. He was the supreme authority over a world, a system, a nation, an empire across the stars. He was the father of 20 individuals just like her, and creator of 100 more than were almost their equal in craftsmanship. Worshipped as god and master by a galaxy-spanning cult, with psychic power enough to turn storms of warp into tatters and gentle breezes, knowledge of technologies and histories now long lost to the rest of mankind, and wisdom beyond the ancients. Who else could possibly be her sire? There was no doubt about that. It had been almost 2 years since she'd been retrieved by her father. Departing from the learned scholars of Prospero with bright smiles and loud boasts, a small detachment from her father's fleet left behind to help integrate them into the wider Imperium. She ignored her nerves as that happened, keeping her indomitable mood up. Prospero was a miserable place, the people tormented by spiritual parasites and their fates as outcasts. Her arrival was a sign to them, a sign of changing fates. They were sometimes irritated by her loudness, her boisterous ways, but they were not thinking about their misery while they were focused on her shenanigans. That was more than reason enough to keep the grin on her face and confidence unshakable. It gave them hope, the best thing she could do for them at the present. She ignored the pangs of homesickness. She was Madonna, her arrogance absolute. There was nothing she could not do if she set her mind to it, no misfortune that could not be averted. So long as she believed in it, they would find themselves believing in her, and hope would spring anew. She wondered how Aemon was doing. She hoped he was doing well. Behold, mind place of study, mind chamber of knowledge, she declared, throwing open the doors to the chamber. She was not quite large enough to open the doors with physical strength alone, which was irrelevant as she was a sorcerer of tremendous power. She used her psychic might to open the massive wrought adamantium doors, leading into the auditorium. Striding into the semicircle chamber, she turned to throw her arms wide, presenting the place for her brother. Like many of her siblings, he had shock white hair that hung down to his hips. Lightly tanned skin covered in strange blue seams that accentuated muscle groups and joints. Currently, his modesty was covered by wings that extended from his upper back and down like a feathery skirt. His eyes roamed the room blankly, reminding her of Sister Danu's frigid expressions. She ignored that look in his eyes and focused on his overall frame. As expected of her father, he looked really magnificent. She could practically see him fighting a whole army on his own. He was a little slow and lazy, judging from his deliberate manner of speech and sleepy habits, but that was just fine. She'd help him learn to present himself appropriately. She was a generous master of sorcery. "Madonna, we all learn here," Sister Fulgrim gently corrected, causing Madonna to click her tongue. That was a less impressive way to say that. Her sister needed to learn how to present these things appropriately. "Please don't confuse our brother. He is not confused. Look upon his gaze. He understands all he perceives." She boasted on his behalf. Fulgrim raised a brow at her, then glanced over at Ibring Light. He was currently staring at Danu, who was holding up a book in turn, a book of architectural notes. He evaluated it blankly before nodding. Danu nodded in turn and set the book down once more. Madonna pursed her lips. Somehow she could feel Fulgrim do the same. Brother was not what she had been expecting. Since saying their names, he had not spoken more than a handful of times. They had shown him most everything they typically do upon the ship thus far, all of it met with idle disinterest. Honestly, showing him this chamber had been something of a last resort. She was running out of ideas to engage him with. Throwing that concern aside, she marched forwards and threw her hands towards the projector. Behold, the device that presents the wisdom of our ancients to us. The hollow projector. She got into the groove of another practiced speech, ignoring the blank look in her brother's eyes. There was something wrong with him inside, an emptiness. It was not like the quiet contemplation of Sister Danu or the stoic presence of the custodians. It was something deeper. She didn't know what to do about it. The thought was frustrating to her. At least he wasn't deliberately irritating like Sister Loffen liked to be, daughter of Wildsea. It took her a while to realize that she was overthinking this whole civilization business. Despite all their fancy words and ceremonies, they were pretty much the exact same as the wilderness she grew up in, just bigger and much more crowded. King Thengir had taught her quite a bit. Most of it was useful, some of it was useless, and often it was explained in the most roundabout ways. What was honor? Thengir gave a great long-winded explanation every time she asked, and it was often pretty confusing. She eventually figured out that honor was just doing what was right and sticking to what you were going to do anyways. What were funerals? Thengir gave speeches on things that elaborated on themselves a few dozen times before, none of which helped until she actually saw a few funerals in practice. Small boats burning, ferrying the souls to the All-Father and away from the wolf ghosts. A funeral was a way to make sure the scavengers didn't get to the bodies or souls of the dead, because fuck those guys. She figured out the trick eventually. Figuring out civilization meant ignoring all the things people said and just focusing on what they do instead. That gave her answers that were way easier to understand. Everything else was just a heaping of gravy over the meat. A giant showed up at the gates, showed off lots of witchery, but sat down in the dirt to share some guest wine with Thengir. Instead of ensorceling the king, that is. Being all polite-like and waiting to enter until after being invited in. Good start. Giant says it's her dad. So she saunters down and takes a measure of him. So she calls him what he is, something she noticed the civilized folk don't take kindly to for whatever reason. Words have to be behind a sheet of ice misdirection for some reason. Instead of getting angry at getting called a big fucker, he laughs loud and hard. That was a good sign. So she goes along with this whole affair. Giant ships the tribe up to the land of the gods with his starfleet, and she goes with him off the planet. She wasn't too bothered by this. The tribe was in a good place now, and she could always come back later to visit again. The Emperor of Mankind was a mouthful. She decided to call him Pops instead. She insisted on bringing her brother wolves with her, though. They had stuck with her this long, she wasn't about to leave him behind. Something he had agreed to, with a grin behind that glow on his face. Real hard to distinguish much behind that. Kinda pissed her off, if she was being honest. Turn the lights down, won't you? That's too bright. Her sisters were pretty fun, she supposed. Danu was a cute one. Fulgrim had a strong name. Madonna was fun to mess with. She kicked off the tree root, roaring in challenge while thrusting the spear forwards. The gorilla beast with red fur turned to roar back at her, and Hathor could throw a fucking punch. The turning of its face caused it to smash directly into the hammer-blow fist of her sister. A boom of flesh and bone smashing into flesh and bone sounded out. The blow knocked the beast off balance and staggering back, deeply wailing in fury and pain. This left it wide open. Kicking off the ground again, her spear made a wonderful sound as it impaled the beast right through its other heart, pinning it to the tree behind it. Her arms shook with the force of the blow, and she took a moment to exhale before pulling back. She turned to grin at Hathor. This hunting trip was exceptional thus far. She had to come back here at some point. Hathor grinned back, raising an arm and patting at her bare bicep, still flexed and tense with adrenaline. Planting a boot on the now limp gorilla, she grunted and strained. A sharp crack, and the wood of her spear splintered, then broke entirely in two. Falling back a few feet before steadying herself, Lofna raised the hunk of now useless wood in her hands and stared at it, then at the corpse of their kill. She grunted before tossing the thing aside. Weak-ass wood. We're running out of spears, Aethor declared. Do you think they'll give us more? Loffen hummed in contemplation before turning to the few men in golden armor. Pops insisted they bring with them, for their protection, or something like that. Hey, you fellas got weapons we can borrow? I broke another spear. The two looked at each other for a moment, then at their own spear-like weapons, then at the broken shafts on the ground. One spoke up. "Can you swear to not break them?" The man asked, voice low and rumbling with amusement. She grunted. No, she probably couldn't. Wasn't her fault. These weapons were too weak. She stomped over to the big beast, probably bigger than anything except the biggest wolves of Fenris. Reaching down, she grunted and attempted to lift it off the ground. "Fuck," she grunted out. "Need a hand?" Hathor amusedly asked, walking over to the beast to help her. "Nope," Lothar replied, straining with the weight. It must have weighed more than a longship. "You keep those nails pretty. Let a big, strong shield maiden like me handle this." Hathor snorted, ignoring her and taking on half the load anyways. Lothar deliberately did not thank her for it, even if the eased burden was pretty nice. Together, they began to drag the kill out of the dense woodland, the custodians making sure nothing snuck up on them. Pops had come to them and asked if they wanted to help him hunt on Caliban. Apparently they had lots of big beasts that needed slaying, and the others were too young to be doing things like this. She had agreed at once, and Hathor was quick to follow. Sis was pretty stuck up at times, but boy did she know how to brawl. Her mace had broken already, shattered against a big six-legged, fire-breathing turtle-looking thing that was entirely too fast. That one was a pain to drag back. They needed the custodians to help out with it. Finally emerging from the tree line again, they pulled their newest kill over to the small army of butchers waiting to get at it. A massive line of warriors in steel plate and waving colourful banners were in front of them, moving aside to let the sisters pass. Behind them was tent after tent set up, military officers and tanners, and all manner of people who worked constantly to process the monsters they killed and brought back. There were songs in the distance, and lots of citizens cheering each time a custodian or group of Astartes dragged another kill out of the forest. This whole affair was planned to take place for a month, the warriors of her father moving to many places across the world and clearing out everything bigger than a bear. Slamming it against the ground with a great thud, the two sisters staggered over to the cute-looking serving boy with the wineskins and drank greedily from them. Handing them back with a sigh, they took a moment to refresh. She made sure to flex and smile for the native warriors. Boasting was a warrior's duty. A massive boom echoed out, and rows of trees shattered in the distance. They paused and turned their heads to look, as did many of the thousands of people present there with them. They watched blankly, waiting for new weapons to be handed to them as their father emerged from the tree line himself. Clad in shiny golden armor, with two building-sized white lions covered in spines and spikes, dragged along behind him. There was a great smile on his face as he hauled it over to the dumbfounded butcher army and dropped the corpses off, before galloping off into the dense woodland again, sword drawn and steps merry, the satchel on his waist bulging slightly. Trophies, no doubt. Lothar spat on the ground, pushing herself up and snatching a few spears from the rack, Hathor right behind her. They had only gotten 7 beasts of note so far, and the day was young. They weren't stopping until they matched father, or it went dark.